A number of years ago, I did a project called The Real-Life Landscapes of Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas, where I went to go find the actual landscapes and buildings of the Fallout game worlds. Where something was pure fiction, I tried to find a meaningful equivalent. It wasn't absolutely complete and comprehensive, but I feel like it hit the highlights. In a certain way, it wasn't even a hard task. The West Coast Fallout games all take place in environments that actually are mostly desert wasteland already. New Vegas and Las Vegas are an easy equivalency to make in terms of mood and environment. I wasn't sure then how feasible or viable an East Coast Fallout video would be. I lived on the other coast, for one, that was a personal inconvenience, but I was also starting at a huge professional disadvantage as well. Washington, D.C. and Boston and their environs are not arid wastelands in any capacity. The actual cities themselves are so much busier and more cosmopolitan than their game counterparts. On the surface, it seemed almost to be a fool's errand. There was seemingly no way to easily reconcile the vast differences between fiction and reality when it came to the real-life landscapes of the East Coast Fallouts. What I discovered in actually making the journey and attempting the project anyway is that I had simply been being presumptuous in my thinking. The Bethesda Fallouts are every bit as faithful to their landscapes as the Obsidian and Black Isle ones. The comparisons just don't come as easily or as broadly. You can't just park the car and step out and witness something that feels like Fallout, like you can in rural Nevada. Yet, once you start digging deeper, beneath the glossy corporate surface of the city skylines, the parallels do begin to reveal themselves, one neighborhood or statue or intersection at a time. For Fallout 3 and 4, anyway, Fallout 76 and West Virginia are such careful dead ringers for each other that I think it'll blow your mind as much as it did mine, so that part's free and easy in the way that the first video was. For Fallout 3 and 4, I had to dig deeper. I had to leave the city and drive deep into the countryside where the real ruin still remains standing, outside the city economies that value land at too high a price to let things molder for long. It would have been impossible to cover everything from each map, and probably kind of tedious in aggregate, so I focused instead on just a few dozen locations, landscapes, and moods from each game. As with the previous video, the real-world locations are listed on the bottom left of the screen, with its in-game equivalent listed on the bottom right. I'll go in order of release and try to include the DLC where able. I'd like to add, also, that while I have given my absolute best effort to the coverage I've done, there were problems I was not able to surmount and things I had to miss. All the Cold War missile silos and bunkers that I wanted to visit in the Midwest on the way out were closed for the season, and I was not able to tour the blast furnace in Pittsburgh that is so central to the Pitts DLC aesthetic. So it's not that I didn't try and didn't bother, it's that travel in the real world is much more complicated than travel in a video game, and it's typically just not possible to get 100% completion. Plus, the challenges of this video genuinely are larger, the first and trickiest of which is knowing when and how to begin. That first moment of Fallout 3 where you exit Vault 101 is a moment that changed the trajectory of modern RPG design. Oblivion had already done it, but Fallout 3 did it with a far greater sense of drama and possibility. I began with Vault 13 in the first video, kind of going in order of the towns you'd progress through in Fallout 1 and 2, but those are games with radically different design philosophies. They do have a linearity to them, whereas Fallout 3 has none. Once you step out of the vault, you're free, truly and utterly free to do as you please. Good for a player, bad for a travelogue. In fact, the very vista that Fallout 3 opens with doesn't exist. There are few tall hills or mountains so close to Washington, D.C. that you would be able to see the Washington Monument and the whole D.C. skyline laid out before you. There are surprisingly few scenic vistas that capture the city as a whole. Yet that overlook, with its sense of tantalizing possibility, is where and how Fallout 3 begins. And if it was entirely fictional, I would have to find a way to recreate it. To the northwest of Washington, D.C., deep into Maryland along its border with Pennsylvania, is an abandoned hang glider launch platform that was shut down by local authorities decades ago. Its concrete foundation still remains, perched above a 100-foot cliff, looking out west towards the sunset and farmlands of Ringgold. I think it's easily one of the most spectacular, beautiful sunsets I've seen in my life. Marked on the map as High Rock, the way the setting sun perfectly falls on the cliff face gives it exactly the drama and charge that the moment of leaving Vault 101 conveys. It's facing the wrong way, of course. Fallout 3 gives you sunrise over the shattered DC skyline instead, the dawning of your first day in the wasteland. The mood, though, is still the same. Before you, before me here in Maryland, is a true open world. Go anywhere, see anything. The hills go forever, and across their undulating surface is every sort of adventure imaginable. Go far enough and you reach the big city. On my personal trip, I did Washington, D.C. last. After this sunset, I kept heading west, back across the continent for home, driving late into the night to make up for time spent lingering in the capital city. The lingering is the point, though. The more time I spent traveling just as I would have in the game, setting my sights on landmarks, exploring detours that appealed to me, finding tiny vignettes of achievement and ruin as I go along, just being alive and curious in a strange place. Well, the more the parallels between the real world and Fallout came through. An open world in a game is largely about mindset. If you approach the real world with a similar curiosity, it's going to feel similarly adventurous. Obviously, don't murder and scavenge while you're out and about, it's rude and against museum etiquette, but the central emotion that Fallout 3 uses to draw its players deeper into the world is the allure of that unfilled map marker just over the horizon, that sense of being close to something both novel and thrilling. If you would only make the journey to find out. There are also obvious differences in aesthetics between the game world and real life, what with there being nothing even resembling desert anywhere near the real District of Columbia. There are differences that go beyond the obvious too. With Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland, the experience of travel is continuous. You can go straight in any direction, but your travel is restricted to public roads and trails in real life. The one advantage of this is framing. The roads of rural Maryland are truly gorgeous, and the way they wind along the hills and valleys going up towards the Allegheny Mountains creates moments of greater beauty than you'd find just going in a straight line towards a map icon. All along the road, you can see the resemblance in the autumnal bare trees and the way they are in the game. You can see a resemblance between the short rocky hills of both the virtual and real landscapes. And most of all, you can see a resemblance in the architecture. The rectangle homes with that door in the middle that are scattered all across Fallout 3's game world are equally scattered across the Maryland roadside, along with churches and supermarkets and truck stops. For example, it might surprise you to know that Fallout 3's Dickerson Tabernacle is completely non-fiction in almost every way. The Dickerson United Methodist Church sits about 40 minutes by car from the D.C. city center, out the long and scenic byways that lead to the foothill farming communities. The church was captured for use in the game in very surprising detail. It was essentially just digitized as is and then blown apart for Fallout 3's aesthetic purposes. This is what I mean about having to dig. You spend 40 minutes driving through a world that only slightly resembles the game, only to arrive at something that is just one-for-one representative. It can be found, it's just occasional and often obscure, unless it's something as utterly iconic as the Capitol Mall. What I was most afraid of with this video was arriving at these places and making just the most basic-ass tourist content possible, and arriving in the Capitol Mall kind of felt like that at first until I could get my bearings. Look, Ma, I made it! Here I am in the big city! When it's something like an abandoned mining town out in the deep desert, it's obvious that a person is doing something at least vaguely adventurous. But when you're competing for space with grade school field trips to see something that millions of people will witness just by watching the news occasionally, it kinda drains the spice right out of it. In Fallout 3, the place is a war zone filled with bunkers and trenches and super mutants. In actual DC, the invading army is food trucks, dozens and dozens of food trucks, all swarming the area with standardized stadium pricing, loudly competing to be the one who sells your child a $10 strawberry milkshake. While the museums and monuments run by the Smithsonian and the National Parks Department all try to keep it very classy, this is, indisputably, one of the most touristy tourist zones on the east coast of the US, and the competition along the sidewalks for all that t-shirt and hot dog money is intense. It is extremely unlike Fallout 3's vibe in every way. But when you get up close, you see how Fallout 3 translated all the essential details of the Capitol Mall anyway, lifting them up from the real world and setting them back down just the way they were before onto the digital map. At the bottom end is the Lincoln Memorial and the reflecting pools. The proportions of the Lincoln Memorial in the game and real life feel well balanced. It has the same sense of presence and space inside the statue's atrium. The gift shop was moved around a bit, but only because it's just like a closet in real life, and Fallout 3 needed a space big enough for a gunfight. Compare this to how Fallout 3 portrays the Jefferson Memorial. To make the Jefferson Memorial big enough for Project Purity and all that combat space, Fallout 3 portrays it as being massively more expansive both on the inside and on the outside than it actually is. It's an impressive space for a monument, but it's a simple rotunda, smaller even than it is in the game. There's only space in here for history, not all the sci-fi gadgetry that Liam Neeson needs to purify the Potomac River. The bridge you cross to get over the river on the way is similarly modest in real life since it was designed for light traffic and not the passage of a giant bomb-throwing war robot. This is interesting to me because of how opposite this is to what typically happens in an open-world game, even Fallout 3 more broadly. Take the proportions of the mall itself. It takes nearly an hour to walk one end to the other in real life. It's actually extremely large. The Washington Monument anchors it in the center, just as it does in the game, with views towards each end. You need to sign up in advance on a website, but it actually is mostly free to go to the top of the Washington Monument. I was lucky enough to snag a reservation using their 24-hour in advance registration, but it was literally the last ticket, and I checked the website 5 minutes after registration even opened. There is a lot of security to go through, but then the elevator exists much as it does in the game. It feels so incredibly strange and special to be in the peak of the thing. Here are the artificial vistas that nature would not provide, a gorgeous panorama of each direction of the city. Compared to other major US cities, Washington, D.C. is not very vertical, just kind of a long stretch of 2 to 4 story buildings petering out into dense, knotted neighborhoods. It's the best view of the city in the game, too, but you can see just how massively large an actual city is compared to anything that would be comfortable to explore in a video game. This is hundreds of times more space than Fallout 3 offered, filled with millions more people. The act of condensing a city into a video game is a very, very tricky one because of this vast contradiction in proportion. To be realistically proportioned is to be too large to be either reasonable or dramatic. It is so much space as to swallow any attempt at focused storytelling or unified aesthetic. From the top of the Washington Monument, you look out over some of the most powerful people in America, and some of its poorest. You look out over marble monuments dedicated to the greatest ideals of the American experiment, and all the fast food chains and payday loan franchises that have come to feed on whatever's left in the modern era. It is too much to ever portray in anything remotely approaching its entirety, which is what makes Fallout 3's interpretation and distillation of the city so impressive. Even at 1/1000th the size and complexity of the actual Washington, D.C., Fallout 3 captures the feel of much that's missing, the contrasts of culture and commerce, the symbols of old institutional power uneasily coexisting with a wilder, stranger world than they were really built for. Down on the mall's grassy expanses, you come to the Capitol building at the eastern end. It only looks scenic from its plaza in the back, across from the Supreme Court. Here the building has both the power and the gravitas that it was built to project. It looks like a hall of power. In Fallout 3, of course, it's full of heavily armed supermutants and a behemoth under the Great Dome. Its grandeur is dimmed somewhat there. Back in real life, around the front of the building, are all these scaffolds that completely obscure the edifice and break the scenic composition of the Capitol Mall. They are still there from the damage done during the January 6th riots, when the steps of the Capitol were filled with aggrieved acolytes of the outgoing president, unwilling to yield to democratic process, wanting little more than to break things and shit all over the place, to be angry and loud. In this way, I suppose Fallout 3 was just ahead of the curve. Whether or not the Capitol building is full of broken glass and hostile mutants is really just a question of if it happens to be an election year when you visit. Your experience may vary. Threading the Capitol Mall together with the rest of the city in both real life and Fallout 3 is the Washington, D.C. Metro subway system. The distinctive design of the subway was something I always assumed was a flourish of the video game, a little mid-century flavor that the modern city would surely avoid. I was amazingly wrong about that. It's the city who came up with the distinctive look. The game is simply paying homage to the real thing. Opened in 1976, the DC Metro has an extremely unified look to it, with the vaulted, segmented concrete creating a modernist, brutalist public space underground in direct contrast to the soaring neoclassical influence in the public spaces above. Even the curves of the hallways leading to and from the train platforms are captured by Fallout 3's interpretation. I found it to be the best way to get around the city altogether, whether in real life or in the game. The rural stations go pretty far into the suburbs, and the dense knot of multicolored rail lines under the mall and downtown allow a person to swap neighborhoods in 5 to 10 minutes that might take 30 or 40 minutes to walk to on foot. It is a tremendously easy-to-use system, easier in some ways than the New York subway system because there are fewer stops and the schedule is simpler. It is considerably better and easier to use than Boston's T subway system. The unified architecture of the DC Metro subway stops is what makes them so distinctive. They all look complementary and complete, no matter how far out into the network you get. The thing preventing it from feeling more Fallout than it does when riding in the real city is that, as an essential piece of city infrastructure, the Metro is always brightly lit and pretty well maintained. Even compared to other subway systems, the DC Metro is relatively clean. There is little rot and ruin to be found, besides the delays that tend to plague the system at peak hours. For the real ruin, you have to go back much further in history. Before DC had a subway system, they had a streetcar system instead. While most of the streetcar system has long been dismantled, there actually is still a small fragment of one of its oldest lines. The Foundry branch once went from downtown out through Georgetown along the Potomac River. To this day, no train service runs to the area anymore. The orange and gray lines go across the river, and the red line angles north instead, towards Bethesda and Rockville. At the end of Water Street, underneath the Whitehurst Freeway, is a footpath called the Capitol Crescent Trail. Fallout 3 incorporates the shorelines, but also pretty much omits the neighborhood. You can find this area around Dukov's place on the game map. In the actual city, Georgetown Riverfront Park is a rather beautiful place to look across the river at Rosslyn, Arlington. The buildings across the river have an anonymous new money look to them that makes them kind of boring as both a tourist and a Fallout fan. This is the architecture I was worried about, these great glass hamster wheels for bankers and real estate brokers. But turn away and start walking Water Street under the freeway trestle, and you'll find plenty of character. Why, here's a genuine entrance to hell right here along the street. I'm not sure if it's disappointing that it didn't actually go to hell, or maybe a relief because it didn't affect my timetable, but all over the place in DC you can find strange little fragments of decay. If you continue to follow Water Street onto the Crescent Trail, the sounds and sights of the city fall away almost immediately. You're among the plants now. The Foundry Line tunnel appears as a detour off the trail to the right. Long ago, the streetcar would have gone through here, but now it's mostly just for bicyclists. The walls of the tunnel are rough, never really improved at the tunnel's long life. When you come out the other side, you're at the foot of the Foundry Line Park, tucked into a small valley next to Georgetown University's McDonough Arena. If you follow the valley back down and climb the hill along the fence line, you can get right up close to what's left of the last trolley trestle of the Foundry Line, built all the way back in 1896. There's an ongoing struggle between the Metro, who want to tear it down, and preservationists who want to restore it and turn it into a bike path. For now, it rests in forgotten limbo, almost invisible to the modernity around it, completely isolated from any modern rail route. Being able to get close enough to peek through the fence is actually lucky as far as DC goes, though. One of DC's largest, best ruins is an abandoned brick factory inside of what's now the DC Arboretum. For whatever reason, the park refuses to allow pedestrian access, and rather than tear it down, they simply enforce the no trespassing thing incredibly aggressively with a 24/7 security guard. I only got close to the fence line and the guy started honking and yelling at me. I finally convinced him to just let me get footage from the parking lot, and he watched me the whole time, ready to bark like a dog if I set 1 foot off the asphalt, and when I was done, he kicked me out of the Arboretum entirely. Luckily, I had already gotten footage of the Arboretum's other famous ruin, a collection of old building pieces called the Capitol Columns. Built in 1828 for the east wing of the Capitol building, installed in 1866 when the wing was ready, the only problem with these displaced columns is that the dome that they were supposed to support was larger than the one proposed in 1828, and the columns looked, to try to sum it up, stupid. They looked puny, they looked wrong, people hated it. So by 1956, these columns are replaced, and the fine old columns had nowhere to go. In the 1980s, it was agreed on that they would look scenic out here among the quiet rolling hills of the Arboretum. And they do. It's just such a strange thing that the columns aren't so much a ruin as they are a sculpture or reinterpretation. Even the foundation that the columns stand on was part of the steps of the east wing of the Capitol building a century ago, replaced and updated since then. But the cast-off piece is sort of like a chunk of the American myth itself, and so people feel compelled to treat even these discarded marble columns with reverence. I suppose that's part of what makes DC such a good fit for the Fallout universe, because even if Fallout 3 isn't very much of a political satire like the Black Isle titles, it still takes that reverence and subverts it. The apocalypse is something of an ironic comeuppance for the United States of the Fallout games, engaging in expansionist wars to plunder resources and annex Canada, creating a bubble of consumerism and optimism that could never shield the country from the cruel realities of the world and the government's immorality for long. Covered in rust and blood and graffiti, nothing in the Capital Wasteland is treated with anything resembling the reverence of the Capitol columns. Since my own America is still in the midst of that terminal stage of myth and greed, it's harder to find something with that uncanny Fallout quality of ironic destruction. If I wasn't going to pin it down in the Arboretum, I would simply have to go somewhere with fewer rules and less oversight. I would need to go up to Baltimore. Just outside of Baltimore, leaving the city east along Interstate 695 off of the Quarantine Road exit, is one of America's crowning jewels of scenic decay, Fort Armistead. Built in 1901 as a station for anti-naval artillery, the base was abandoned just 22 years later in 1923 and donated to the City of Baltimore Parks Department. For 100 consecutive years, the tunnels and storerooms of the old artillery emplacements have lain crumbling in darkness, filling up over the decades with water, garbage, graffiti, and bad vibes. I've never seen anything remotely like it. When I say abandoned, I mean abandoned. This is technically a city park, but outside of the fishing dock by the trash-strewn parking lot, it seems to receive absolutely zero attention from anyone in any official capacity. So something kind of amazing happened. The same conditions that create the Raider aesthetic in Fallout actually happened here, to the same observable result. You have the structure itself, over-engineered to the standards of more industrial-era, thick concrete and rusted iron bars that will take hundreds of years to decay, maybe thousands to fully fade away. Then you have untold decades of decontextualization and disuse. The military base stopped being useful or relevant to the military after World War I. Teenagers have been coming out here to drink and litter since the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. After enough decades of purposelessness, lack of context or purpose becomes the purpose. It becomes a canvas for whoever wants to project something onto it. Layers accumulate, not just of neglect and grime, but also of strange and temporary moments, lost parties and forgotten drug trips, sometimes joy, sometimes pain, sometimes poverty. It belongs much more to the folks who come here with cans of beer and spray paint than it ever did to the US military. And yet, without that faded institutional power, it wouldn't be here as a canvas for the partiers. There's a strange union of authority and anarchy through art going on here. Plus, it's fucking spooky. The tunnels go awfully deep, probably 500 feet or more, back into the hillside, and once you're inside the place, it's a genuine maze of small concrete closets and winding circular hallways where the metal roof panels dangle down in ragged sheets. There's a sense of potential menace that I found myself listening to more than looking at, trying to sense beyond the cone of the flashlight and figure out if I actually was as alone as I thought I was. Outside of a video game, how often does a person experience this particular mood and aesthetic of exploration? This is a hard thing to find, especially as a public park. I suppose the reason the DC Arboretum posts that security guard by the abandoned concrete factory is that they don't want it turning into something like this. But the people typically in charge of public parks don't often understand what an amazing thing decay can be, how ruin can be part of the civic experience. The Arboretum should have something like this, something a little jagged and sinister. Fort Armistead is the most post-apocalyptic, raidery place that I've ever been. It truly does outshine so many desert ruins on the West Coast in sheer size, depth, and decay. It doesn't sit in an arid wasteland, but that wouldn't enhance it either. One of the things that makes Fort Armistead so surreal and so compelling is that it can't be seen at all from either the road or the parking lot. The trees and the foliage obscure it completely. It's hidden, like so much in Fallout, waiting only for the traveler to decide that the map marker is intriguing enough to investigate for themselves. Outer Baltimore holds one more extremely Fallout-feeling surprise, the ghost town of Daniels, Maryland. Typically along the East Coast, there isn't any such a thing as total abandonment of a whole actual town. The land is too valuable and the population too dense. There might be years when a plot of land goes by without a buyer, but someone generally does always come along eventually. In the American West, this isn't the case at all. Rural desert only has value in bulk, so it's actually quite easy and common for people to just walk away and leave whole towns and factories. It's not even worth the money to tear them down. Daniels, originally Ellisville, was founded in 1810 and drove its economy with textiles. It suffered a lethal double whammy in the 1960s and 70s. First, the textile mill finally shut down and nearly everyone lost their jobs. And then, in 1972, Hurricane Agnes made landfall and created some of the worst flooding conditions in East Coast history. What was left of Daniels was drowned and shattered. Today, it's not really much of a ghost town by, Nevada standards. It's got 2 churches, some miscellaneous foundations, and a half-dozen wrecked cars sitting in ravines where they were washed into back in 1972. A trail winds along the Patapsco River to get there. What's so Fallout about it is the details and the composition of the scenes. The flood of 72 didn't just wash any old cars down the ravines. It washed exactly the style of late 50s Big Fin era cars on which Fallout bases its own automotive design. Then the 2 churches are equally scenic in opposite ways. The first one, up a hill on a small spur trail, is the older one, made of heavy stones quarried from the surrounding hills. The Stanislaus Costa Church is almost a European ruin, tucked among the trees with a small cemetery in the back. It's pastoral and melancholy, but not quite Fallout, except for all the rusted cars strewn around it for contrast. The contrast gives it back the Fallout feeling, since an actual European ruin wouldn't have half as many discarded Cadillacs and Buicks lying beside it in the dirt and dead leaves. And that dash of Americana is powerful. Moving along the main trail, you'll pass under a railroad trestle with this amazingly on-the-nose graffiti. Civilization is over, rewild or die. People talk a lot of shit about video game artists creating fictional graffiti that's way too thematic and on the nose, but something I hope this video variously shows is that it is actually impossible to be too on the nose when it comes to graffiti. It's often more chaotic and way more lurid than it is in video games, but if you poke your nose around enough, you see stuff that would absolutely get called out as being unrealistic or too writerly in a fiction setting. The second church, the Pentecostal Holiness Church, is the Fallout aesthetic down to its minutiae. It's falling apart and shattered in an absolutely perfect way, with its unstable bell tower and half-up, half-down walls. All it needs is a smattering of containers to loot and a ghoul or two to be perfectly artificial. This is what I meant about digging a little deeper to find the Fallout experience in real life. You can't just go to the exact place on the map and expect it to be that way, or even remotely close. You've got to detour far off the Fallout path, to the next city up the road in this case, and hike along to it. Sometimes the contrast between the pre- and post-apocalypse is the thing that does make it interesting, though. Take the town of Rockville, or as Fallout 3 names it, Landmine. Rockville in the game is just a collection of shattered houses, the famous landmines, and a very angry old man all on his lonesome. In reality, Rockville is a large DC suburb of many thousands of people, homes, and businesses. So I thought maybe I'd just go to the historical district and see what that's like. I didn't realize what a useful visit this would be, not because it resembles Landmine in Fallout 3, but because the various houses of the historic district are very representative of the precise type of mid-century homes that dot the entire world map of Fallout 3, not just Landmine, but Andale and all over the place. I honestly had no idea until exploring the city how faithful to the city the game was, not in the complete vision, but in the myriad details that construct a sense of place. It even tells some history that Fallout 3 doesn't, to actually visit the historic district here in Rockville. Because I was born and raised on the West Coast, I often forget that Maryland was a slave state. It surrounds the capital city of the Union on 3 of 4 sides, and yet it was a slave state. This plaque tells of a man's escape from slavery from this exact house. Slavery can have an abstract quality to it. Growing up in California, there are no reminders of it there. It's a thing you learn about in books. On the East Coast, it's something that confronts you around every corner. Such a lovely pastoral house. And for many years, its walls abided by some of the worst evil that one person can do to another. Fallout 3 might have more lurid scenes of past violence to come across, but the DC area is hardly devoid of them in real life, which I might not have seen or found out about if not for getting out of my car and exploring. That wasn't always what I had time for, though. Here, for example, are downtown DC row houses in the exact style of the game's row houses as seen from the street. Sure, they're intact and modernized, but the bricks of both fiction and nonfiction are essentially the same here. Back on foot, I found that Fallout 3's fancy downtown hotels have the exact same roof lines as the real-world Willard Hotel. They're even fancier hotels too, like the Waldorf Astoria, also within spitting distance of the White House. Though I don't actually recommend spitting anywhere near the White House like that, because it's not just regular cops downtown, it's the Secret Service, ready to suddenly appear from thin air at the first hint of aggression. One of the slightly unnerving things about walking the halls of power is being elbow to elbow with its elite enforcers. Rivet City kind of exists in real life along the spectrum of uncomfortable proximity to power. There just isn't an actual aircraft carrier. On Google Maps, the Washington Naval Yard looks open, and within its campus is both the National Museum of the U.S. Navy and, more to this video's focus, the Cold War Gallery Museum, featuring a genuine atomic bomb casing on display. They are, sort of, open to the public. What you have to do is check in at a front office and submit to an immediate, full-spectrum background check. The mood in the office is the most rancid I've really ever encountered. Picture a sad, underlit bureaucratic office hellscape like the DMV. Now imagine everyone behind the DMV counter is armed, uniformed, and the threat of immediate arrest hangs over every document you fill out. Meanwhile, you wait in line with every independent contractor and truck driver trying to get on base that day. The queue is well over an hour. And as I sat there, I asked myself, am I 100% sure I'm not about to be arrested? I dodged that bill for failure to provide insurance information from Kirkland County Courthouse for 8 years. It's in collection, sure, but is that enough? Am I about to be billed? No, I'm no longer 100% sure that things are fine. In fact, if I was going to design a honeypot trap for myself, a free Cold War museum would be the most perfectly cartoonish lie for me to fall for completely. Holy shit, I realized. I'm going to fucking jail. Delusional or not, I put on my best Jimmy McGill smile and asked for my driver's license back, and if they would kindly just shred my background check application, which they agreed to do while scowling and giving me the stink eye for wasting their time. Right outside that front office on the 11th Street bridge to Anacostia Park is a little overlook that did the trick just as well. You can plainly see from the curve of the river and the shape of the shoreline that this is exactly where the ship that forms Rivet City would be docked. If you are active or former military, you'll probably have an easy enough time getting on base, but if I have any advice to give, it's definitely that the Naval Yard is not actually a tourist destination, no matter how inviting it appears on Google Maps. Another place authority stepped in the way of adventure is at the National Archives. Not only is there a no photography policy inside the entire museum, the policy is enforced by actual members of the Secret Service and not just typical museum docents. They speak to each person individually before you can see the Bill of Rights and the Constitution to make sure you understand to not even so much as pull out a camera or a cell phone. It is one of the most remarkable temples of the American Union in the city, and one of the quirkiest quests in Fallout 3, and all I've got to show for it are the outside steps. Lord, it's worth it to go, though. It is history, myth, and powerful present reality all at once to go and look at the founding documents in the soft, low-impact light of the rotunda. I'm just sorry I can't share it. The museums of the Capitol Mall are not only free as a gesture towards the democratic ideal that education should be a right to all Americans, they are absolutely outstanding and surpass their video game versions in every way. I wish I had found time for even more days to explore them and linger over the details. They're not something to speedrun on a timetable like I ended up having to do. Let's start with what's parallel. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum is the real-world version of the Museum of Technology in Fallout 3 and contains many of the same exhibits. Here we see the Wright brothers' original flyer with its wide wings and simple engine. What makes it so impressive in real life I can't convey any better than Fallout 3 did. As soon as it becomes just an image on a screen, the flyer loses its power. To actually see this thing and stand next to it is to behold an artifact of global importance, a transition into an age of miracles, and only in person does the fragility of this early pioneer come through. The thin canvas of the wings, how small the oiled gears of the motor are, how obvious it is that it came from the workshop of bicycle people and not some modern lab or think tank. Upstairs is the Space Technology section, a dense knot of displays and artifacts about the universe unlocked by the Wright brothers' invention and the rapid conquest of terrestrial flight. The lunar modules are there, rocket engines, all sorts of things, including the radio dish that Fallout 3 tasks you with collecting for 3Dog. Across the way on the Capitol Mall, the Natural History Museum is so much larger than it is in Fallout 3, and instead of the Underworld exhibit, there are mostly permanent displays on a variety of sciences and disciplines. It's too bad that this didn't really make the transition to video games, because the Hall of Minerals is probably the most amazing single collection of objects that I've really witnessed. First, rocks from space. Not only do they have more fallen meteorites than I knew it was possible to have in one place, many of these iron core space rocks have been sliced in half to show that they truly are completely metal in most instances. These strange geometric lines are called Widmanstätten patterns and cannot be reproduced by humans because of how they're created in nature. Large asteroids and comets often have molten cores, like planets do, cores which cool over time as the rock bleeds heat into the void over the millennia. The molten nickel-iron core forms these patterns as the core slowly cools down over that extremely long period of time, somewhere around 10 million years. You could no easier form a mountain chain in a laboratory. It's a geologic process, but one that can really only occur within the hidden cores of the rocks that move through the dark vacuum of space. Here, a piece of the moon. There, a vial of actual stardust, an accumulation of the bright particles of long-dead stars that actually do drift in space. And if earthbound rocks with human stories are more your jam, you can walk less than 100 feet and arrive at the Hope Diamond. You hear Natural History Museum, usually think of big dinosaur skeletons, and they've got those too in tremendous variety and outstanding quality. The Smithsonian Museum simply takes what you expect and goes harder in every way, showing off the national collection, the best of the best, the rarest of the rare. And for no admission fee. Hell of a thing. The Ghoul's Underworld honestly doesn't feel like it ought to be part of the Natural History Museum. Its vibe has more in common with the National Gallery. The multiple levels and dark marble flourishes within the National Gallery really tie the two buildings together. I imagine the National Gallery was excluded because of what it is. As an art museum, Fallout 3 would have to create a massive amount of art for it. It would be a time sink of design hours. In real life, the gallery is an essential part of a trip to the Capitol Mall. All the other museums are storehouses of science. This is a massive and meandering complex dedicated instead to emotion, to the feeling of America, Americans, and what good taste is defined as at a national level. Fallout 3 is itself visual art. It's closer to these paintings than it is to anything else I've shown you in terms of medium. A couple centuries from now, when people are actually living in the years that the games are set, Fallout 3 will still matter in this same way, as art. What does it say about the era it was created in? What values were expressed in the art? Does it still communicate the emotions it was trying to convey? I can't speak to how Fallout 3 will be evaluated 200 years from now, But as much as it is an object of play and a consumer object, as frustrating as some folks find Fallout 3 as a game, it still is, primarily, art. It is still primarily about communicating emotion. Its skill in communicating a sense of possibility and adventure is why we're both here as a viewer and as a video maker. You don't even have to stick to the museums and city center to feel that adventurer's spirit. One of my favorite smaller locations in Fallout 3 is Girdershade, a far western dot on the map where a woman named Sierra has a huge shrine and visitor center dedicated to the glory of Fallout's #1 fictional beverage, Nuka-Cola. Naturally, this doesn't actually exist, but let's try and distill Girdershade's essential characteristics anyway. It needs to be the remains of a small business somehow tucked underneath a freeway cloverleaf with enough room for ramshackle homes to pop up around it. So, with that template in mind, I tried to find something that would fit the bill. It is therefore my greatest pleasure and enthusiasm to introduce you to moderately successful construction company Verser Incorporated, future home of the world-famous Nuka-Cola Museum. The two buildings of its campus sit tucked underneath the freeway cloverleaf in Springfield, Virginia, where the I-95 and I-495 exchange hundreds of thousands of cars a day. I tried walking up closer to the cloverleaf, but decided that probably wasn't ultimately a good idea. In any case, here I was, underneath the freeway, experiencing the basis for the fiction even if the fiction itself couldn't be found. I could kinda squint and vaguely picture it. I tried to find the Galaxy News radio building the same way and discovered a Fox News station relatively close off the Bethesda town subway exit. It's not exact, but there is a little plaza there, and if you squint hard and really want to, there is a kind of similar vibe in the intersection. Bethesda, the company, ironically, doesn't actually exist in Bethesda, the town. They're in a corporate office park up by Rockville instead. I was lucky enough to be invited by Bethesda's mod wrangler Andrew Sullivan to come out and see the campus, but the company at large made me sign an NDA and asked me not to take pictures. I am, however, allowed to mention the life-size Mr. Handy model that they have in their lobby with articulating arms and eye apertures. There are so very many Fallout artifacts in the common space that I was allowed to see at Bethesda. I even got to pull out my paper maps and explain this project right in the middle of getting to do it, in the heart of where the games are actually made, which is probably one of the most singularly flattering and surreal moments of my life. Andrew was even kind enough to hike with me out to Daniels when I went. He hadn't heard of it before, and that's something that seemed common among DC residents. No one seemed to know what I was talking about when I rattled off the ruins that I was trying to find. My favorite bar in the city is the Quarry House Tavern up in the suburb of Silver Springs, a former speakeasy with one of the most welcoming and friendly vibes that I found on any bar in the East Coast. I remember pulling out Google Maps to try to prove to a disbelieving couple that there was a ruined factory and aqueduct along the bike trails that go along the Potomac River. This is the Seneca Creek Aqueduct. Long ago, in 1834, the Catoctin Aqueduct opened up, sending small boats up and down through a series of locks in a kind of classically European style. One of those locks was here at Seneca Creek. Partially destroyed in the storm, the brickwork is what mostly remains of it now. But it's a fragment of a much larger piece of lost infrastructure. In fact, it's a fragment of an entire way of life that hasn't existed in the city within living memory. Some boats on the aqueduct and canal would have been loaded down with goods from here, the Seneca Creek Mill and Quarry. The quarry and aqueduct are actually right next to each other, but you access them from opposite banks of Seneca Creek, turning down Riley's Lock Road for the aqueduct and down the smaller, fainter Shifley Mill Road for the quarry. It's very quiet and very scenic, an extremely beautiful ruin waiting in the woods not half an hour from the city by car. Even the antique 1950s-style farms of Fallout 3 can be found if you look hard enough. Just outside of the actual town of Olney is the Agricultural History Farm Park. It provides the exact aesthetic on which Fallout built and then deconstructed its own post-apocalyptic farms. Here's the Big Red Barn. Here's the line of antique tractors, the line of old farm equipment and harvester machines that look weirdly deadly up close. Honestly, if there's anything the farm park taught me, it's that Fallout 3 significantly underutilized farm equipment as a basis for weapons, traps, and raider decor. There's the pastoral old farmhouse, and because this is Maryland, the plaque explaining the role of slave labor on the farms just outside the capital city of the United States. Is this the very farm that's near the entrance to Vault 92? Probably not, although for a very hilarious reason. In terms of its relation to the map, Vault 92 would actually be an OBGC community park, where every October, Olney hosts a massive outdoor haunted house called Field of Screams. I arrived just after Halloween and missed the Field of Screams, but they were still disassembling it when I got there. It is extremely funny to me that in both Fallout 3 and the actual town of Olney, Maryland, most tourists come to get the shit scared out of them and run away from big monsters. Really, the hardest out of all the basic templates of map locations in Fallout 3 to find within the DC area are caves. You've got to drive way out into Virginia for that. There are 3 caverns on which Fallout 3's Little Lamplight might be based, and so my process was to look them all up and choose the one which most closely resembled the Fallout location. I was, of course, condescendingly corrected on Twitter immediately. Apparently, in some interview, a developer stated that Little Lamplight was based specifically on Luray caverns. The actual Luray caverns look nothing like the Fallout vibe, though. They're much fancier, much more built up. And I didn't have time for both, and I only discovered the thing about Luray after I'd already arrived at these caverns, so yeah, wrong caverns, thanks a lot. I was a little bitter about that, which didn't improve much as the tour got underway. It was just me and an old couple from Florida, and the woman giving us the tour sounded so utterly apathetic and so bored that I kind of assumed she'd disappear at some point and just leave us down there to fend for ourselves. I would have preferred it if she did. She told the scripted jokes with such absolute venomous disdain for the punchline that all the humor became dark humor about her frustrating reality of telling 3 idiots the same story about a hole in the ground at 9 a.m, the same story she'll have to tell all day, the same story she has surely told 100,000 times before. Caves are wonderful, beautiful things. It's capitalism that's soul-killing, so I don't really hold her barely restrained fury against her. Not really. It was just a real intense mood to start the day with. Skyline Caverns aren't really on her side, either. They're neither very large nor very decorated, and most of what makes them scenic is clever use of colored lights. There are, however, some crystal formations entirely unique to Virginia here in these caves, these anthodite formations. Delicate and beautiful, they grow in every direction despite gravity, gravity being something that usually affects crystal development in other formations. These anthodites are the reason to visit Skyline Caverns. I suppose it's lucky then that Little Lamplight is intended to be Luray Caverns instead, because those little bastards probably wouldn't be able to keep their greasy little fingers off of rock formations like these. Neither can today's tourists, hence the chicken wire. Tourism is a hard needle to thread for both proprietor and tourist. There is such a constant push and pull between conservationism, preserving the thing that people travel to see, and exploitation, fluffing it up and selling it off to maximize profit instead. Skyline Caverns does its best not to be tacky, but being tacky is the game, and it's playing for profit. Some things deserve to be treated with reverence, which is why I usually prefer national parks and monuments. Treating what's meaningful with the solemnity it's due makes a moment much more powerful in the remembering of it. One of the last places I went in D.C. was certainly the most solemn and serious, Arlington National Cemetery. This is another instance where the reality was shrunk down to much smaller proportions in the game. Those smaller proportions take away from the meaning of seeing Arlington in person. Those crosses go on across the horizon. It is a city in itself of the honored dead. Historically, there's a fundamental and deliberate irony to Arlington Cemetery, too. Formerly, this was Arlington Estate, owned by Robert E. Lee and his family. Lee, if you aren't familiar with Civil War history, commanded the Confederate Army as their most famous general. Following his surrender, Arlington Estate was seized in a tax dispute. Lee's family home still sits at the top of the tallest hill in Arlington Cemetery. So this place that eventually became the absolute peak of honor for American burial began as a kind of condemnation of the Confederacy, taking the land that Robert E. Lee used for domesticity and recreation and repurposing it so that no one could ever again forget the violence that Lee and the Confederates wrought. Ever since, it's persisted as a kind of symbol of sacrifice for the American Union, a place to reflect on those who were willing to give up their lives in various ways for the American project. I had very little time, but if I was going to see any particular grave, I thought I ought to go and see the eternal flame at Kennedy's grave. When Kennedy was shot in November of 1963, it was one of those moments of instant division between one era and another, like 9/11 was for my generation. Nearly anyone who still remembers the Kennedy assassination remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. Kennedy's bright-burning, short-lived presidency, and especially his assassination, marked the end of the 1950s self-perception as an age of innocence and new beginnings after the horrors of 2 world wars and a Great Depression. It wasn't actually innocent, of course, and the vast difference between that consumerist utopia of TV commercials and the petty violence and cruelties of the real world is what the whole constellation of Fallout's dark ironies and iconography are based on. When Kennedy died, it popped that bubble of ignorance, just a little. The social movements of the 1960s didn't exist in a world that was materially much different from that of the 1950s. It was simply no longer sustainable to pretend that racism wasn't evil and that American imperialism did anyone any favors. The divisions between modern America and the poisonous nostalgia that Fallout satirizes began, in a way, here, in the heat and light of Kennedy's eternal flame, casting the shadows of our national shames against the wall and making them plain. Arlington National Cemetery really is a deeply sad, emotional place to visit. Hundreds of thousands of people lie buried here. The crosses form optical illusions like cornfields do as they go on, row after row. It's also one of the only hills surrounding the city tall enough to get some kind of vista. In the evening light, the Washington Monument stood tall and bright against the evening sky. It was one of the most beautiful views of the city that I got to see, topped only by being inside the Washington Monument's peak. It's exactly the kind of view that Fallout 3 was continually presenting me, scenic, melancholy, loaded with symbolic meaning, and a sense of possibility. Fallout 3 may not have much memorable dialogue or a thrilling main plot, but goddamn if the mood of the Capital Wasteland doesn't come back to me time and again. Here it was, that same sense of loss and longing, the contrasts of a civilization built on beautiful ideas about equality and truth, whose choices and consequences have led it, instead, down a self-destructive path of consumption and hatred. Fallout 3 took Washington, D.C. to the end of that path. I hope, for my own world, that we aren't so far along as to be unable to turn back. The Capital Wasteland of the Maine campaign doesn't ever manage to get very far away from D.C., just a few bends of the Potomac River westward. It left it to the DLC to create more exotic environments with new color palettes and moods. Not all of them are useful to a travelogue. Broken Steel adds little of interest beyond the epilogue and the ability to keep playing. Mothership Zeta is just comic book alien nonsense, and there was no way I could afford a visit to Alaska just for an Operation Anchorage segment. It would add weeks of travel and thousands of dollars in expense for not really very much. But I could do Point Lookout, and I could certainly do the Pit. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't able to do the Pit very well. Some parts are easy enough. Here, for example, is one of the many river bridges leading into the downtown area. You'll see that it's exactly the same style as the one in the game, except without quite so many landmines to dodge around. Getting deeper into the downtown area, you can see also how well Fallout 3 adapted the local style of red brick skyscrapers. In Fallout, there isn't the remarkable contrast between the old, early 20th century style of building and the giant glass and steel megastructures of the early 21st, which makes the Fallout version of Pittsburgh feel a little smaller, a little more dreary. Downtown Pittsburgh, in real life, truly is a beautiful place. It was a great choice as an urban area to contrast Washington, D.C. Its industrial verticality is like the opposite aesthetic to the marble monuments and short row houses of the capital. What genuinely sucks is that I couldn't line up a tour of Pittsburgh's greatest, most post-apocalyptic attraction, the Cary Blast Furnaces. The Blast Furnaces only did weekend tours during the season I was traveling, and both times that I was in or near Pittsburgh, it was on a Tuesday. The giant, rusted hellscape of the steel mill level is actually completely based on the real-world infrastructure that used to power the whole Pittsburgh economy. This footage is from a movie filmed inside a steel mill in California in the 1950s, and I'm sorry to say, that's the best I can manage. The Pit is one of my favorite pieces of Fallout content. I look forward to it every playthrough, so if you're irritated with me as a viewer for missing out, you're not half as irritated as the guy who drove across the whole damn country only to be turned away by a locked gate. If you're doing your own tour, plan in advance. Do the blast furnaces. Besides them, modern Pittsburgh suffers from the same problem as much of the real-life landscapes of East Coast Fallouts. It is so modern and doing so well that much of what makes the game memorable is lost in the shuffle of everyday life. People don't want radiation and marauding mutants. They want a coffee and a sandwich, and Pittsburgh is very pleasant and livable that way. Like in the main campaign, finding the landscapes of the DLC becomes easier the more rural you're able to go. Point Lookout has always been one of my favorite areas in the Fallout franchise because of how strange the landscape seemed to me. Swamps? In my Maryland? It's more likely than I thought. Point Lookout in real life is a very small, often forgotten state park at the bottom of a peninsula next to a town called St. Mary's City, Maryland's oldest European settlement, where colonization of the area first began. It is a fascinating place, but small, and with a natural environment somewhat unlike that of Fallout 3. The Point Lookout DLC is actually an amalgamation of several parts of rural Maryland, all jammed up together for maximum effect. The grand ruined boardwalk, for example, of shuttered tourist traps and a decrepit Ferris wheel that sets the mood for the whole DLC at the beginning, is actually 200 miles away from Point Lookout itself, along the large eastern peninsula, in a famous tourist haven called Ocean City. In summer, Ocean City would be absolutely packed, but I visited in mid-November, arriving around 10 at night. And I walked up and down the boardwalk twice without seeing a single living soul. The cold ocean winds batter the boardwalk constantly, shaking the black plastic bags that cover some of the signs and kiosks, providing an extremely eerie impression of a person that proves to be false when you get close to it. Sure, it might not have the decay that's fundamental to the Fallout aesthetic, but the uncanny loneliness I felt visiting in the off-season was so intense it pretty much made up for it. One of the very strange things about attempting this project was not knowing when or where the mood would run parallel to the games, being constantly surprised by the places where I felt as if I was really adventuring. I mean, in summer, this isn't much of an adventure at all. It's a family tourist extravaganza. It's designed to leave the biggest impact on someone who's 12. Windswept and deserted, it acquires an odd menace, like reality is thin and a person might slip through the cracks if they're not careful, disappearing into the fog. In the morning, the illusion broke for the most part. In winter, townies claimed the beaches and boardwalks, jogging and doing light construction or maintenance. I knew from Google Maps that Point Lookout didn't have a boardwalk, but I hadn't realized that Ocean City is pretty much either the direct inspiration or so close a dead ringer that it doesn't really matter. It was honestly one of my favorite stops, well worth the 200-mile gamble to go and see it. Staring out at the waves rolling under the boardwalk pier, chained and locked for the season, there was a tremendous and rugged beauty to the place. The ocean harsh and cold, the beach coarse and fraying from the winds, the distant metal rattle of all the many closed storefront shutters, the giant empty resort hotels stretching down the coastline. America is a very large and extremely weird place. It's hard to feel lost within it while safe in the embrace of corporate franchise suburbia, but there are so many places where the seams and edges of the thing are more obvious and visible, like Ocean City in November. What's ironic is that the actual Point Lookout isn't nearly so harsh and exposed a coastline. Tucked between the mouth of the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay, Point Lookout itself is a stunning and scenic place that sees far fewer visitors than Ocean City ever does. Instead of a boardwalk pier, it's got this fishing pier. The winds are strong, but not rip the skin off your face strong. It's actually just really nice. There's nothing Fallout about the actual Point Lookout, although it has certainly expanded my understanding of what East Coast nature can look like. The coastal reeds go right up against the beach, along with the trees, creating an effect that is so much more welcoming than anything in the DLC. Pretty much anywhere you look is straight up beautiful. I was lucky enough to get to tour Point Lookout with Michael Smith, a member of the Point Lookout Historical Preservation Society. He gave me an overview of the peninsula's strange history, which goes much deeper than I realized from the DLC's irradiated swamps. As obscure as it is today, Point Lookout is one of the places that America began, before it was a nation, during the era of the 13 original colonies. In 1621, an English noble named George Calvert, or more commonly Lord Baltimore, established a colony in the far north of Newfoundland. It sucked, and he hated it. Rich enough and powerful enough to simply try again, he set his sights south to what would become Maryland. He died before the colony's charter was finalized, but George's son Cecil, the second Baron of Baltimore, picked up the torch. Intimidated by the idea of actually crossing the ocean when the time came, Cecil Calvert assigned his younger brother Leonard Calvert to lead the expedition. Leonard was given 2 ships, the Ark and the Dove. In 1633, the ships made landing here at St. Mary's City, the first colony of Maryland. So the Calvert Mansion and the ghoul hunting down the final son of the Calverts in the DLC is no real joke. It truly is the oldest European family in Maryland. I even met a woman who's a Calvert back in D.C. at the Quarry House Tavern. She didn't know her family was in a video game, and when I told her, she laughed and wondered if she could get any money for it, at which point I had to break it to her that the game came out in 2008. Point being, the Calverts are real, and they're still all over the area. They just don't have an actual mansion on Point Lookout anymore. There actually isn't any mansion quite as grand as that or the old Blackhall Manor in the game. But there are some that are kind of close, out the old carriage roads that still wind unpaved away from the main byway. This, for example, is the Woodlawn Farm, a surviving example of a 1700s-era coastal manor house. A lot of the architectural details and flourishes are similar to what was incorporated into the Fallout 3 DLC, but in real life it is comparatively modest. So like with the Jefferson Memorial, you can see how sometimes a game needs to expand a space instead of shrink it to create a viable space for gameplay. If this was the actual size of the Calvert Mansion, that sequence would be over 90 seconds of combat. The historical Calvert Mansion is similarly unsuitable because most of what's left is these ruined foundations and low brick walls. You can stand in front of what was once Leonard Calvert's fireplace, but it's a museum kind of experience, not a wasteland kind of experience. Similarly, the Ark and Dove Cathedral doesn't exist in the proportions it does in the game. The in-game cathedral takes its name from Leonard Calvert's 2 ships. A replica of the Dove floats docked right next to the St. Mary's City Historic District today. If the game's cathedral is based off of anything, it's likely the 1667 brick chapel. This isn't the original, it's a replica based off of painstaking research. The original was built by the Jesuits in 1667 and then demolished in 1725. It's a symbol of what was called at the time the liberty of conscience, a freedom granted colonists by the Act Concerning Religion passed by Leonard Calvert in 1649. It allowed Maryland colonists to choose any flavor of religion they like, so long as it was some version of Christianity. So Protestantism and Catholicism flourished side by side under the system, which is better than how it often was back in Europe, but kind of underlines the kind of equivocations and compromises on the definition of liberty that created, from the beginning, the conditions that led to the Civil War. Maryland, again, was a slave state. Whatever freedoms the colonists enjoyed, the fields of St. Mary's City were tended by slaves. And when that became intolerable to the conscience of the nation and the Civil War erupted, this tiny peninsula became home to one of the largest prison camps of the whole conflict. It's odd that the DLC shifts around this history some. It features, instead, the Turtle Dove Detention Camp, which is an odd mashup of several wars and war crimes that the US committed. In the lore of the game, the US fights China, so in the DLC it's a Chinese detention camp, which is a reference, of course, to the actual historical legacy of the World War II US domestic policy of imprisoning all Japanese Americans and confiscating their property. It's one of the most shameful acts of 20th century America, but it isn't a Maryland phenomenon exactly or specifically. Most Japanese internment camps were placed out west, away from negative public opinion where people couldn't see them. This, for example, is what's left of the Tule Lake camp, just a few fields and buildings left to attest to the fact that tens of thousands of people were once imprisoned here. This camp is in Northern California. Down south, the camp of Manzanar is maintained as a much more comprehensive museum to the fact that the Nazis were not the only ones to operate ethnic concentration camps during World War II. In most other places, like Tule Lake, the land has been sold off and repurposed, the wounds buried under used tire shops and Dollar Generals. It's an important history to discuss, but it's not local. In Point Lookout's actual local history, it was here on the tip of the peninsula that the Union Army operated Camp Hoffman. The prison camp was designed to hold 10,000 Confederate prisoners, but overcrowding was constant, and it usually held a couple thousand more than that, even up to double capacity, with 20,000 prisoners crowded into the camps by the end of the war. Little remains today besides the Union barracks, maintained and reconstructed by the Historical Society. A major reason for this is that the Union soldiers occupied some of the only permanent structures. Confederates were given little more than tents. Over the course of the war, around 4,000 prisoners died of starvation and exposure here at Camp Hoffman. The Confederates killed quite a few prisoners themselves in the deplorable inhuman conditions of their own prison camps, of course, not to mention the death toll of slavery itself, but there is no point in sanitizing it for comfort. Camp Hoffman was a place of terrible suffering, even if the folks suffering were assholes fighting on the side of racism and cruelty. Strange to imagine, though, with how quiet it is out here now. The bulk of the prison was down on the tip, where the Point Lookout Lighthouse is now. You can see that the lighthouse isn't a tower-style lighthouse like it is in the game, it's less dramatic. The lighthouse came much later, long after the war ended and Camp Hoffman shut down. It sits on a piece of land small enough that it seems impossible that 20,000 people could ever have fit in such a space. And the truth is that they didn't. The shorelines of Point Lookout have been steadily eroding for decades. The prison camp's former borders stretch hundreds of feet into the choppy waters of Chesapeake Bay. The saltwater marshes on which the DLC's swamps are based have mostly disappeared with them, aside from little fragments here and there. To find the swamps themselves, we have to pivot back across the bay, back towards Ocean City, where the last of Maryland's once vast swamplands are protected as part of the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. Salt marshes are, as far as natural environments go, surprisingly rare. It takes an uncommon agreement of freshwater, saltwater, particular sediments, and unique plant life to spring them into existence. Global warming has raised the level of the water in Chesapeake Bay by 1 foot over the past century, and with the climate crisis only accelerating, this will likely increase to 3 additional feet of water depth by the next century. If this happens, all of Maryland's salt marshes will completely disappear. It will be a dead and gone ecosystem. Fictionally speaking, humans love a nuclear apocalypse because it's fast, dramatic, and total. It's easier to get people to agree to take action against it because they just can't keep keeping on if it happens. Environmental apocalypse is harder to grapple with because it happens slower than we perceive, and it's frankly pretty easy for most people to just keep driving into work and back in the face of it. If the salt marshes disappear, when the salt marshes disappear, it won't be humans who face the consequence. It'll just be a slice of voiceless biodiversity that took millions of years to create and just centuries to kill. The asphalt of the road and the bricks of the old chapel will persist just fine. Life after an environmental apocalypse can be life as usual, just diminished from what life used to be in such a small way as to be broadly imperceptible to a majority of people. That makes it easy for people to say, who cares? Who will speak for the Blackwater Wildlife Refuge, among all the other problems we create for ourselves as humans? The disappearance of flora and fauna are hardly the biggest outrages perpetrated in the swamps, after all. Here in the Blackwater was where one of the great American heroes of the Civil War was born and shaped into who she became. Born Araminta Minty Ross, Harriet Tubman was held as a child slave right here on this exact farm, not 5 minutes from the Blackwater Wildlife Refuge. Her owners were a family called Brodus, who beat her repeatedly, even though she was just a child. It kind of surprises me that this is still a farm at all. How can you keep tilling the soil when it's blood that once watered the crops? Isn't it awfully uncomfortable to have people come up to the interpretive plaques and consider the vicious legacy of slavery and then just kind of wave to them from your tractor? Or maybe that's just the South, so full of old wounds and half-forgotten crimes that a person just gets numb to it. Further up the road is the Bucktown General Store, preserved from the time of Tubman's childhood, where a slave overseer threw a 2-pound weight at another slave and struck Tubman in the head. She suffered seizures and other medical consequences all of her life. When she was old enough to be her own woman and choose her own path, she chose to escape, and then return, again and again, helping Maryland slaves escape through the Underground Railroad that she helped pioneer. Her life of struggle and accomplishment is celebrated at the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Park. As someone who grew up on the West Coast, I assumed that the North and South were somehow geographically and culturally distinct, the way the colors in a textbook map are so definitive in showing what's what. It's not really like that at all. We're less than 100 miles outside Washington, D.C., in the middle of a salt marsh on a sparsely populated coastline, and this, too, is the South, as far as slavery is concerned. Maryland never seceded from the Union, but its loyalties were very split. 80,000 Marylanders served in the Union forces, while upwards of 20,000 fled to Virginia to join the Confederate Army instead. Prior to the Civil War, in the election of 1860, just 2.5% of Marylanders voted for Abraham Lincoln. He was about as unpopular around here as it was possible to be. Later, Harriet Tubman herself came up from the Underground Railroad to fight for the Union in broad daylight during the Civil War. She worked alongside Union Colonel James Montgomery, scouting, planning, and then leading the Combahee River Raid. She became the first woman to lead a military action during the American Civil War by doing so. Alongside Union troops, Harriet Tubman razed several plantations and facilitated the mass escape of 750 slaves to waiting Union riverboats, who escorted them to safety long before the local Confederate garrison could stir to effective action. Harriet Tubman lived a life of incredible sacrifice and bravery, and she lived it here. There's nothing in the fiction of Fallout that could possibly compare to her lived reality in terms of true courage or danger. All of this history turns uneasily in a quiet plot of land on the north end of Point Lookout State Park, right before the entrance kiosk. Here are 2 monuments to the Confederate dead. One is historical, maintained by the Parks Department as a memorial to the fact that however justified the Union was as a cause, they still did let 4,000 people die from hunger and the cold ocean wind in the prison camp that used to be here. You'd hardly know what ever happened now, but the monolithic gravestone serves as a reminder. Next to it, however, is a private monument constructed by the descendants of one of the men who died in the camp. It is the first time in my life that I've seen full-throated, unapologetic Confederate revisionism out in the wild. It's on private land, the Parks Department can't do a damn thing about it. It proudly flies all the old Confederate battle flags, which is bad enough, but it's their plaques that are truly insulting. Here's a 1-2 punch of Confederate apologia that I never thought anyone would have the audacity to say aloud, let alone commit to a plaque. Of the Confederate stars and bars, it blames me for my own discomfort, saying, quote, "We recognize that to some people, flags of the South represent nothing more than icons of hatred. To those individuals, we extend a friendly hand of sympathy and understanding. Their lack of understanding is not so much a reflection upon themselves as an indictment of those institutions entrusted with a serious task of education, higher education, and news dissemination." End quote. And a hearty go fuck yourself to them as well, but this is paired on the other plaque with the most absolutely ahistorical thing I've ever seen in my fucking life, beginning with misusing a Frederick Douglass quote and then going on to state, quote, "When Robert E. Lee's army marched into Gettysburg and when the Confederate Army of Tennessee defended Atlanta, the troops were not all white. Thousands of blacks, free and slave, marched with the army as servants, nurses, surgeons' assistants, musicians, laborers, and in many combat roles. Black Southerners were an important, integral part of the Confederate Army and Navy. On the home front, black men provided much of the infrastructure of the Southern war effort." End quote. Yeah, no shit black men provided the infrastructure of the Southern war effort. That's the point of slavery. The Confederates built everything they had off of violence and coerced labor. And yet the installation tries to twist the historical fact of forced participation to paint a picture of willing cooperation, erasing slavery's consequence to try to both sides of the issue and use a weirdly modern language of inclusion to try to throw a rug over the entire institution of slavery. It is flatly disgusting, and the way it mimics the graphic design of official Parks Department plaques must make local historians' blood fucking boil. History means acknowledging that the Union killed the ancestor of the person responsible for these plaques in a pretty fucked up way, but history also presents millions of instances of greater violence and human degradation within slavery as an institution. When I first played the Point Lookout DLC for Fallout 3, I didn't understand what the backwater yokel mutants were all about. Wasn't that a little mean or unfair? Wasn't that more of like a Southern stereotype anyway? Well, I get it now. It's not nearly so off base as I thought. Even if they look perfectly pleasant on the surface, anyone willing to put up a disinformation plaque like this excusing slavery is some kind of moral mutant in my book, and they don't even have the excuse of prolonged radiation exposure rotting their brains to defend their backwards bullshit. The history of real American abolition, both past and present, is so close to the surface here that it's odd that Fallout 3's Point Lookout kind of dances around the edges of substantively engaging with it. Of course, that reluctance of the Fallout games to address the history of slavery in explicitly historical terms doesn't quite end there. If we follow the actual Underground Railroad up from Maryland, we find it leads directly to the heart of Boston, where the Fallout games pick that thread right back up. At least with Fallout 4, it's a lot easier to know where to begin. Fallout 4 begins where America began, in a field outside Concord, Massachusetts. On April 19, 1775, at 9:30 in the morning, the first casualties of the Revolutionary War took place on this exact spot. The British were here, where in Fallout 4 the Red Rocket gas station would be. The Colonials were on the other side, where Fallout placed the neighborhood of Sanctuary Hills. 3 British soldiers were killed and 9 wounded, while colonists suffered 2 deaths and 4 wounded, all in a matter of seconds. This was what's singularly referred to as the shot heard round the world, the beginning of the American Revolution. All history must actually begin somewhere, with real humans making extremely consequential choices within a matter of seconds. Once unbottled, the American Revolution poured out across the 13 colonies from Massachusetts and changed the course of global history. This has always been the history that inspired Fallout 4. The sole survivor of Vault 111 emerges into a new American wilderness and takes it upon themselves to construct a new nation out of the ashes. National rebirth is at the heart of so many of Fallout 4's themes and quests. It's to each player to decide exactly what American rebirth happens to look like from a handful of available options. The neighborhood of Sanctuary Hills would be along this curving path. Vault 111 would be further on, but it's fictional, so what there is to see is mostly down here along the path. Broadly, the North Bridge and the surrounding area is called Minuteman National Historic Park. Preston Garvey might be a famously annoying character, but his obsession with recreating the Minutemen makes sense from being around these parts. It's impossible to even exist in Massachusetts without finding some plaque or statue honoring the Minutemen. To someone growing up among the rubble, I can see how this would be inspiring. Sympathy for Preston Garvey. Already I'm finding my expectations challenged by the actual reality of the Fallout world map. The tutorial segment has the player moving next into Concord, just up the road. Something that genuinely shocked the hell out of me in exploring the Boston area is that frequently the pedestrian proportions of distance between one landmark and another feels roughly equivalent to how it is in the game. Not much shrunken down at all. It can be absolutely uncanny, especially in the downtown area. Parking in Concord sucks, though. It sucks real bad by design to try and get tourists to pay extortionate parking fees up by Walden Lake. Minutemen Historical Park has free parking, so I walked from the North Bridge to Concord, to the museum, and then to Walden Pond and back. The proportions are certainly shrunk down from real life, but the proportionality remains insanely faithful. Fallout 4's map is, when you get down to it, an attempt to explore its real-life counterparts from a pedestrian perspective, more faithful to Boston than even New Vegas is to Las Vegas. It's an extremely careful, impressive act of translation. I was never able to appreciate that before because I didn't really know a goddamn thing about Boston when I first played the game of Fallout 4. Concord truly is a nice 5-minute walk down the road from Sanctuary Hills. The little commercial downtown area has a similar construction and vibe, and the big churches and civic buildings all share that New England look. The only thing really different is the location and look of the Concord Museum. It's further up the road than it is in the game, on the way out of Concord in the opposite direction, next to Ralph Waldo Emerson's house. Truly, there it is. East Coast history can often be as dense as European history because it did unfold on a human pedestrian scale. Their world was a walkable world, and for long distances there were the carriage roads. California is not really like this at all. The real Massachusetts was, to me, nearly as foreign as the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, just a whole lot less dangerous. The Concord Museum is a fine introduction to the region. It has a lot of art, and its exhibits go into detail about the native history that the American colonists tended to deliberately attempt to erase. You'll see a replica of Emerson's office and an example of the kind of home interior you could have expected back in the Revolutionary era. Not so different, really, than the world of Fallout 4. Non-electric, dirty, a little impoverished. The Concord Museum in the game has a different, more military focus. Fallout's famous opening line, after all, is "War never changes," and that's the thematic focus for Fallout 4. Concord, real Concord, is more complicated than that. Its legacy is political, as the birthplace of the Revolution, and it's literary, as home to Thoreau and Emerson both. Walden Pond is just a quick walk down the road, a little longer than in the game, but perhaps equally dangerous on account of Concord's refusal to create a pedestrian sidewalk, all in the hopes that you'll value your safety at the price of $20 per parking spot. Well, fuck that. That's not how we do things in the Wasteland. Going to Walden Pond has a funny double resonance because it's used by the game to reinforce its themes of self-reliance through some canned Thoreau quotations. It's all very touristy within Fallout 4, with a big old gift shop building. The actual Walden Pond is much quieter, less built up. Thoreau's old home lies piled in a heap of old stones. The path around the pond is worn by the passage of thousands of bicycle tires and millions of feet. Little exists now of the grand nature that Thoreau experienced. Walden Pond is a refuge among the farms and shopping centers nearby. His world, though, and Fallout 4's are equally distant in terms of wilderness. In Walden, Thoreau wrote, quote, "It is remarkable how easily and insensibly we fall into a particular route and make a beaten track for ourselves. I had not lived there a week before my feet wore a path from my door to the pond side, and though it is 5 or 6 years since I trotted, it is still quite distinct. It is true, I fear, that others may have fallen into it, and so helped to keep it open. The surface of the earth is soft and impressible by the feet of men, and so with the paths with which the mind travels. How worn and dusty, then, must be the highways of the world, how deep the ruts of tradition and conformity." End quote. I have, indeed, fallen into that exact path of soft earth, as have so many others. In fact, Thoreau's famous love of nature was so strong that his beloved pond was recreated in an ultra-violent digital role-playing game over 100 years later, a game he almost certainly would have despised with every fiber of his puritanical little being. How deep the ruts of tradition, indeed. If you take the time to get into it, Walden can be as off-putting and disagreeable a book as it is impressive and elevating. Thoreau, for all his love of nature, was not really an adventurer. He would not have felt at home in the post-apocalypse. Emerson might have done better. Emerson wrote, quote, "Whatever you do, you need courage. Whatever course you decide upon, there is always someone to tell you that you are wrong. There are always difficulties arising that tempt you to believe that your critics are right. To map out a course of action and follow it to an end requires some of the same courage that a soldier needs. Peace has its victories, but it takes brave men and women to win them." End quote. To me, that's as concise a summary of an RPG protagonist as it's possible to make. Leaving Walden Pond and walking back towards Concord, the exit to the park is as darkly ironic as anything in Fallout. Walden Pond is now completely surrounded by local business byways carrying huge amounts of car traffic. What was once Thoreau's retreat from the hustle and bustle of, Concord has given way to a traffic artery that carries more human beings a day than Thoreau might have met in his entire life. It isn't a nuclear apocalypse, but modernity has utterly annihilated the world of Walden just the same. Thoreau would be as bewildered and appalled as Vault 111's sole survivor on returning to the world after centuries of cryogenic sleep. Some things are more or less just the same as they are in the game near Concord, though. One of the first places you're likely to find in Fallout 4 is the Abernathy Farm. In real life, if you truly want to, you can visit the Drumlin Farm instead. It's a museum farm run by the Audubon Society. It's a fine example of the kind of small-scale farming that still dominates this part of eastern Massachusetts. The buildings are pastoral and cozy. They even have this handsome fox friend if you're lucky enough to catch a glimpse of him. This is the kind of thing an East Coast Fallout trip is made of. In the absence of an actual wasteland, without any blasted cityscapes to look out over, a person winds up packing the itinerary with anything remotely close to what's in the game. Would I have visited the Drumlin Farm if I was not on a Fallout tour? Well, probably not. It's lovely, though, and a window into a truth about travel. Travelers often prioritize what's extraordinary about a region, not what's ordinary, not what's regular, not what actually keeps a place fed and alive. In an open world like Fallout 4, you do see the whole thing. Your curiosity takes you everywhere. In an open world like Massachusetts, the impulse is often to just drive right on by instead. Some things, though, you couldn't just drive past if you tried. It's rare to find something so truly environmentally absurd that it seems straight out of a Bethesda Fallout, but very close to the Drumlin Farm is one of eastern Massachusetts' weirdest, smallest roadside artifacts. Ponyhenge. Pony by pony, it has grown into this plastic and porcelain menagerie just off the side of the byway. Clearly, the work of a stable mind. Absurdism flourishes in the world because people love doing things just for the hell of it. Ponyhenge is exactly the kind of thing you'd see in a Bethesda Fallout, maybe done with garden gnomes instead. To visit Ponyhenge is to drink deeply from Fallout's essential spirit of absurdist adventure. And it doesn't stop with that either. It's entirely possible within the scope of eastern and central Massachusetts to see a good number of amazing ruins and unsettlingly strange things before ever even arriving in Boston. Why bother following the main quest right away, after all? Boston is a much larger city than Washington, D.C., denser, richer. It's impossible to get a sense of the landscape within the urban core or the major suburbs. So let's wander out here for a minute before moving inwards towards Diamond City. Finding good ruins in Massachusetts is difficult, but not impossible. Smack in the center of the state, above Springfield, is a small town called Holyoke. Down a decommissioned road along a winding path through fallen leaves deeper than my ankles, I arrived at Scott Tower. Scott Tower emerges from the trail perfectly framed, a beautiful ruin among the small townhouses and businesses of Holyoke. The town below never quite lived up to the artistry and class suggested by the tower itself. While some of the steps are shattered now, the tower is still perfectly scalable today. Created in 1942 for a big community park, Scott Tower was built to provide scenic views of the mountains and valleys where the land begins to lift upwards from the coastal region. When you finally reach the top of the tower, the view really is tremendous. When this was new and clean in the early 40s, the vibe must have been incredibly on point for Fallout. I'd like to imagine women in mink shawls gazing out and smoking moodily from the top. As far as the decades since the 40s are concerned, Scott Tower has been party central for so long that the entire thing is as much paint and puke as it is stone and mortar. Good for them, though. If I was a teenager in Holyoke, I wouldn't want to get crossfaded anywhere else. Just to the north on Mount Tom State Reservation is another fine ruin from an even earlier era. In 1861, a luxury resort hotel opened up here on Mount Tom. Called the Eyrie House, it was actually a semi-famous destination for many decades. In 1901, however, it burnt completely to the ground, leaving just foundations and a few walls. There's little to suggest its former grandeur. The small fragments of building that remain seem like it could just as well be part of an old church or something similar. What's impressive in 2023 is what was impressive in 1861, the view across the rolling hills and colorful foliage of central Massachusetts. It truly is a spectacular vista. The road is no longer open to motor traffic, but for a long time a person could drive right up to the old Eyrie House ruins. The old parking lot makes an incredible viewing platform for the valley below. Fallout 4's Commonwealth is a little more bare and bleak than the Massachusetts of real life, but I imagine in deep winter, the difference is less apparent. In late fall, however, Massachusetts has incredible colors. It's truly gorgeous. Instead of being bleak, there's a beautiful melancholy to it, the last gasp of color before the snow and the cold and the dark. Holyoke is pretty far off of Fallout 4's map, though. Closer to the Commonwealth, to the northeast outside Worcester, is another excellent ruin, hidden deep in the woods. The roads to get there are tiny, winding, one-lane roads. This is about as deeply rural as a person can really get in Massachusetts, which is kind of thrilling. I had this impression like the entire state was as densely settled as Boston, but that's not the case at all. The population truly thins out the closer you get to upstate New York and the Hudson River. At the heart of this labyrinth is the Rutland prison camp. Unlike many prison ruins I've seen, Rutland wasn't the heart of any particularly unusual suffering. It was a work camp for low-level offenders, drunks and public urinators and such, who would be forced to work on the Rutland farm for the duration of their short sentences. The food they farmed would then be used to feed the other prisoners in the walled prisons elsewhere in the state. I don't believe much in any kind of prison, but the worst a person could say about Rutland is that it sucked a lot, and that is unusual. There's often a lot more cruelty than that involved in the American justice system. Today, just a few buildings remain, most impressively this hospital structure built back into the hillside. Leaving Rutland, I decided to take a longer and more meandering route through the woods than I had arrived with. I wanted to see if the deep truck trails out here north of Worcester held the same kind of rugged thrill that the Commonwealth Wasteland does. and I'm pleased to say that there's definitely a resonance there. The way the road winds across the low hills, the way the light shines through the falling leaves in bright God ray shafts, Fallout 4 did a rather spectacular job of capturing the feel of rural Massachusetts. Eventually, the road weaves down to this little glade with a stream running through it. It was so perfectly scenic and picturesque, not marked on any map as anything in particular, not on the way to anything, just a beautiful place jumping up at me from nowhere like a fleck of gold on the bottom of a stream bed. I had found adventure because I was adventuring. This is true for these outer woodland areas in a dramatic and immediate way, but it can be equally true for the city's densest urban core if you just approach the urban core with the same attitude. Most of what I saw of Boston I experienced in one extremely long day of walking 14 total miles across the city, with a supplemental day on the subway to catch what I had missed and head down to Jamaica Plain. Boston is a terrible city for driving, but absolutely incredible for walking. I'd never been in an American city designed with these kinds of proportions before, pre-industrial proportions. So let's do a walking tour of a common progression path across the Boston downtown in Fallout 4. It blew my mind doing it this way because of what a genuine scale model of the city Fallout 4 created. The map is smaller than the real city, sure, but the relation of one landmark to another and the distance between them is preserved with an insane fidelity to detail, which I never would have figured out if I hadn't tried to experience the city on foot, the same way I did in the game. The curves of the Charles River, for example, are much more accurate in Fallout 4 than the Potomac River was in Fallout 3. A player's first experience of the Boston inner city in the game is likely crossing the Charles River over from Cambridge through Alston and by the in-game Oberlin Station, eventually arriving here in the Back Bay. Commonwealth Avenue connects the outer neighborhoods along the Charles to Boston Commons in the main downtown, passing right by Kenmore Square and Fenway Park. This is down by the giant Citgo sign, as good a landmark as any in that part of town. In the game, this is where the Mass Pike Tunnel lets out, and it's that way in real life too. You walk across quite a few lanes of freeway traffic on the way to Fenway Park. If you want to see the inside of Fenway, you've got two options. You can go and see the Red Sox, or you can take the tour. I wanted to take the tour, but I was early in the day. There was a big opportunity cost in waiting around to take it. I would have had to sacrifice 2 or 3 other things to get that Diamond City view. So I'm sorry to say that I don't have that to show you. Fenway Park is enormous, though, and just as completely integrated into the downtown as it is in the game. It's perched right above the freeway in its own little neighborhood, which then fades into the Back Bay Fens and crosses a stream to Back Bay proper. Back Bay is a fine commercial district, not quite yet at the foot of the skyscraper forest, but leading right up to it. Hangman's Alley and Backstreet Apparel are along the stretch in Fallout 4. In real life, there are hundreds of businesses here along Boylston Street. It feels very modern, at least until you reach the Boston Public Library. Opened in 1895 as a public palace of learning, the library is 1,000 times more impressive in real life than it is in Fallout. Don't get me wrong, it's a fine little dungeon for Fallout 4, but the real library has art and sculpture covering nearly every surface. It would have taken a crazy amount of development time to portray it in its full glory. I've never really seen anything quite like it. It's got a very deliberately European feel to the building. Adventurers will note the top-floor murals in what was once called the delivery room, where special book requests were brought for patrons to read. Painted by Edward Austin Abbey, they depict Sir Galahad's quest for the Holy Grail. It is wild how Abbey's art has aged into a kind of modern familiarity. This sumptuous fantasy style can be commonly found today among card art for Magic the Gathering or Dungeons & Dragons supplements. What was once reserved for elevated high-culture mythology has been democratized in the modern era, borrowing this kind of artistic gravitas to give weight to myths that are more recreational than religious. The quest for the Holy Grail doesn't get much more main quest than that, really. Across the plaza is the Trinity Church, also depicted in Fallout 4. It was finished in 1877, suggesting that at the turn of the 19th century, this was a pretty happening neighborhood to be in. Designed by Henry Richardson, this was ground zero for a whole architectural movement that he invented, the Richardsonian Romanesque. It became a bit of a fad in church and civic design for a while, and it began right here. Following Boylston Street to the end leads you right into Boston Commons, a meeting place for city residents since before America was even a country of its own. It serves a similar function to Central Park in New York, albeit much smaller, a giant splotch of soothing green in the middle of the concrete forest. The gap between the skyscrapers puts the skyscrapers into sharper relief, framing them against the sky, accentuating how absurdly tall they rise from the city streets. In actual Boston, it holds the Frog Pond, a shallow depression that fills with water in the winter and becomes an ice skating feature. In Fallout 4, this is portrayed as being a little deeper, Swan's Pond, deep enough to hide Swan the Mutant inside of it. Looking around at all the skyscrapers, you'd think that Boston was a big city, and it kind of is, but all of that bigness is condensed, mostly, just into this area east of Boston Commons, within just a couple square miles. Boston is intensely walkable in every way, in the game or in real life, and in both, the best way to take that walk is along Boston's famous Freedom Trail. Developed in 1951, the Freedom Trail is a scripted point-to-point route through the city that tries to weave together the most important historical locations into one afternoon's worth of focused tourism. In Fallout 4, you are also asked to follow the Freedom Trail, but leading to one particular destination, the Synth Underground Railroad underneath the Old North Church, over by all the Italian restaurants on the north end. The Freedom Trail is a genius way to condense the city's history down into a singular, easily accessible experience, and it can be easily expanded to take in a couple extra Fallout 4 landmarks as well. Beginning at Boston Commons, the Freedom Trail first curves past the new State House and the Park Street Church. Just walking the streets, it's clear to see how well Fallout did in conveying the unique architecture of the city. Washington D.C.'s fictional counterpart had houses, businesses, and apartments that looked completely consistent with their real-life counterparts. So too with Boston's iconic red brick and white-painted wood aesthetic. All that's missing is the decay. Around the corner is the Granary Burying Ground. These urban cemeteries from the 1700s are actually in several locations around the Boston downtown. Samuel Adams himself is buried here in this one. Woe betide the real estate developer who suggests moving over 2,000 dead Revolutionary War heroes and civilians. The thing Fallout 4 does with ghouls coming up out of the grounds of the cemetery doesn't make a lot of sense, but it definitely is a vibe that works. These headstones are so old that it seems like any kind of monster could be buried down there. It's strange to have all this old death tucked among the modernity, but again, this is an American discomfort. European cities are full to bursting with tombs and graveyards. Not everyone just paves over them like Los Angeles does, but West Coast folks are often aggressive about obliterating their own path, so aggressive that one can forget that people like history when they grow up around it. Boston exists in a kind of hilarious tension with its past and present. Further down the Freedom Trail, for instance, is this fine red brick building, the Old Corner Bookstore. Back in the 1800s, this was the center of the literary world in America. The men who published Thoreau and Emerson met here regularly. Now, it's a Chipotle. For now. It won't always be a Chipotle, but it'll probably never be anything so culturally significant as the Old Corner Bookstore again. Could be worse, though. The old City Hall has had to adapt to the times by renting out most of its square footage to a Ruth's Chris steakhouse. The Freedom Trail continues inside the Old South Meeting House. This grand public debate hall was where the Boston Tea Party was planned and where the order was given to begin that endeavor. The deep revolutionary past and the gleaming modern present exist side by side in Boston in an obvious and omnipresent way. You cannot avoid revolutionary history here. It's around literally every corner. So it makes a lot of sense and feels very appropriate how Fallout 4 leaned into these parallel experiences of the city. Besides Diamond City, one of the main settlements in Fallout 4's Commonwealth is called Good Neighbor. It's a discrete zone within the game map, but in real life the neighborhood is called Downtown Crossing, and there are no borders at all. You have to kind of figure out Good Neighbor's boundaries by using the old estate house as an anchor point. This is where Hancock the Ghoul and Hancock the Man both made their respective histories. The old state house is presented in the game very similarly to how it exists in real life, including the central spiral staircase. Hancock the Man's outfit is actually really on display here as well, although my footage of it didn't save properly and came out black. Fallout 4 creates some really hilarious historical parallels without explaining what they're doing, and I missed them on the first time on account of it. The balcony, for example, where Hancock addresses Good Neighbor during his big speech is the exact same balcony where the Revolutionary War was first declared out loud. The old State House was the seat of British colonial power in Boston when Massachusetts was still a British colony. It's a pre-American civic structure, so it's fascinating and fun to expand that out and make it a post-American civic structure as well. The very spot where all the folks stand listening to Hancock make his speech is where the Boston Massacre transpired, tipping the scales from anger towards armed revolution and putting Massachusetts at the tip of the spear in terms of sentiment against British authority. Slightly off the Freedom Trail, but still in this Downtown Crossing neighborhood, is Fallout 4's Combat Zone, more popularly known in actual Boston as the Orpheum Theater, tucked down an alley called Hamilton Place. The theater is likely where the fighting arena was in the game, but if you can't see a show, you can go underground instead and visit this weird food court at the bottom of a short staircase. If you're ever in downtown Boston and think to yourself, boy, I sure could use a 90s mall food court, but don't want to buy anything at a mall, hey man, this is your jam. I'm not sure who else would enjoy it, but it's there. A far better food court option would be Faneuil Hall, the next stop on the Freedom Trail proper. Built in 1741 as a marketplace and meeting hall, the building is still largely used for those exact same purposes, housing an absolutely preposterous amount of small restaurants and shops crammed into 2 levels of antique commercial space. Faneuil Hall is a beautiful building, but illustrates the paradox of American institutional beauty. This grand public marketplace, dedicated to free speech, free trade, and free men, was built with a significant amount of money made from the selling of slaves. Its wealth was built off of denial of freedom and institutional inequality. And that is so much of the cool, beautiful stuff from that era. It was made to elevate the spirit and instill a sense of patriotic belonging, but only to certain folks, only under certain conditions. Which is why Fallout 4's choice to substitute a synthetic version of racism for the real thing is so irritating from a historical perspective. The Underground Railroad in Fallout 4 is for robots only, escaping their masters in the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. The railroad is headquartered here, under the Old North Church. I would have liked to get a peek inside, but it was all locked up while I was there, and it seemed a bit much to wait for Sunday and attend church as a matter of video game tourism. It wasn't ultimately that much of a loss because this whole neighborhood, the North End, has an intensely distinctive look to it. Maybe if you grow up around it, then all this old red brick will just blend into the background. To my eye, it is wild to have a city with such aesthetic consistency. Sure, it looks more regular and more modern America, anonymous American, outside the urban core and even in other downtown neighborhoods besides the North End, but the more time I spent in Boston, the more I understood why it was appealing to set a Fallout game here. Boston's architectural aesthetics are richly detailed, equally strong in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. To see all these things lying broken and dusty beside each other in the 24th century world of Fallout 4 has a very appealing resonance. It's a deeper well of art and history than you'd get with a place like Las Vegas. It might not pop the way Vegas does, but Boston's a very beautiful city in its own, more traditional way. The whole vibe of the Boston downtown in Fallout 4 is completely intact from the way it actually is. The red brick alleyways and passages really are as tight and winding as they are in the game. The big, glimmering, and sometimes intimidating skyscrapers rising into the clouds, all crowded thickly together on the Revolutionary-era streets, creates that verticality which makes Fallout 4's map so distinct from the other Fallout world maps. That feeling of massive density, of map icons and landmarks lying just around the corner from each other, is palpable down on the streets of real Boston. Exploring the city on foot in real life greatly increased my respect and appreciation for the broad design of Fallout 4. I might prefer the wide-open wasteland to the dense and vertical urban design of Fallout 4, but the amount of detail that the game successfully translates from the real Boston to its imitation is remarkable. And it doesn't just successfully translate the details, it translates the vibe, the mood that all that history and all that money piled up on top of each other create. Post Office Square is one of the map landmarks in the game, so I made it a point to find it in real life. I had, because I'm an idiot, neglected to bring an umbrella. In Seattle, the rain comes down slow and light and constant enough that most folks just get around without one. I hadn't seen a downpour like this in a long while, so I smoked a joint and waited it out, relaxing while the rain came down around me. Boston's an everyday, unimpressive place to a lot of people, but I had come for adventure, and adventure was what I was experiencing, all alone in an old and strange place with nothing but a plan and a wad of cash. Which is important because Boston is expensive as fuck. The way modern wealth has transformed the city is the most disruptive of all to the Fallout mood. Take the docks. I expected them to be, actual docks with warehouses and ships. That's actually done elsewhere now. In Fallout 4, this would be the pier from which you start the quest with a Chinese submarine. In actual contemporary Boston, this is one of the wealthiest, newest downtown neighborhoods. All glass and steel and corporate-approved food and drink. Like some kind of coffee chain called Tate, whose pitch seems to be Starbucks, but hella pretentious. Finding equivalents to the smaller businesses in Fallout 4 is basically a fool's errand. They either don't exist the same way or don't exist at all, and finding equivalents takes away time that could be spent on more impressive landmarks, like the Shamrock Tap House. Which Irish pub in Boston is it based on? Kind of, sort of, all of them, right? Or none of them in particular? Here's an Irish pub, Hennessy's. I liked it. That kind of tourism matters to the tourist, but food and drink tourism to me just isn't very interesting to share, especially compared to the historical stuff. Though these two things do sometimes intersect, like the Warren Tavern. Built in 1780, the Warren is the oldest bar in the state of Massachusetts. If you're the kind of person who cares about customer reviews, you'll be interested to find out that this was Paul Revere's favorite tavern. That Paul Revere. George Washington's funeral speech was delivered here at the tavern, and mourners raised a pint in his honor. Still here, still tapping them kegs, hundreds of years later. The Warren Tavern is up in the Bunker Hill neighborhood, just across the Charles River to the north of the North End. The Bunker Hill Monument is dedicated to an early battle of the Revolutionary War where it took the British 3 attempts with an overwhelming force to dislodge the colonials from their position on the hilltop. While not a martial victory in the technical sense, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a public relations victory instead, creating a reputation for the colonial army as tenacious and courageous. Fallout 4 creates its own Battle of Bunker Hill, of course, but between the Institute of the Brotherhood of Steel and the poor Bostonians caught in the middle. Fallout 4 did well recreating the proportions of the space. The hilltop park is the perfect size to build a small community like the one portrayed in the game. And a little injection of sci-fi never hurt anything, least of all the proud USS Constitution. Built in 1797, the Constitution primarily saw action during our second war with the British, the War of 1812. That's where it got its nickname Old Ironsides. There's no rocket engine strapped to the back, of course, but the way the interdecks are laid out and arranged is captured very well by the game. The Navy operates the USS Constitution as a free museum as part of a community outreach program, but since it's not on a naval base, there's no paperwork, just a metal detector and some dirty looks if you take too long fishing stuff out of your pockets. The boat is pretty fascinating. This was, for 1797, an extremely advanced and expensive machine of war. Now it's kind of quaint by the standards of modern naval weapons. It might not ever receive an ending so absurd as the one Fallout 4 gives it, but the ship is an all-American relic. I have pretty much total faith that it will be around in another couple hundred years. The Constitution and Bunker Hill are technically the last stops on the Freedom Trail that began in Boston Common, but there are more Fallout locations all over the place, like the Charles River Esplanade across the river. Instantly recognizable is the Hatch Memorial Shell, a park venue for concerts. Constructed in 1941, it's exactly the kind of mid-century high-culture structure that looks so good covered in dirt and decay within the Fallout setting. The Charles River Esplanade is the best way to get a good panorama of Cambridge and MIT on the other side of the river. Away from the downtown, the park is quiet, peaceful, and pleasant. There's a stylish statue of Arthur Fielder, who conducted the Boston Pops Orchestra at the Hatch Shell during its heyday. It's not a very Fallout experience, but sometimes it's enjoyable enough just to be out and about in my own open world. It wasn't my initial intention, and I was a little drunk to be doing it, but a major highlight of my trip for me was how my quest went to see the inside of the Great Dome atop MIT's Building 10. I'm used to universities where you can go where you please, open to the public, but MIT doesn't quite work like that. There are electronic locks on everything, and if you don't have a student access card, the campus is closed. Officially. I walked up to the back entrance of Building 10 and tried some of the doors, all locked. I was willing to give up, right then. But a student inside helpfully popped open one of the doors for me, so I just said thank you and tried to look like I belonged, which, as an overweight, nerdy white guy, I had no trouble doing whatsoever. I never did go to college myself. I was immediately so impressed by MIT. It would be amazing to study and learn in a place like this, full of winding corridors and intriguing multicolor laboratory doors. It feels overwhelmingly professional, which I am not. I'm a weirdo who drove into town in a beat-up Thunderbird, walked 12 miles, and had 3 shots of whiskey before coming in here to try to find something that I only knew from a video game. Rather than avoid people, I asked anyone I saw how to find the Great Dome's underside. No one could actually tell me. They had all heard of it, one person even identified it as a library under the dome, but not one student I spoke with had actually ever bothered to try and go there. Well, here it is, baby. There was a second electronic lock on the entrance to the small library, so I just crouched down outside the door glass to get this shot, possibly concerning the few students milling about in there. It was only after I got outside that I realized what I had done, and I just started cracking the fuck up. I had snuck into the Institute, just like in goddamn Fallout 4. What I assumed might not be possible at all, I managed with a positive attitude and a heavy buzz. Now, I truly felt the Fallout vibe. I was wasteland scum, skulking about where I didn't belong, in the beating heart of American technology and education. Unfortunately, you can't sneak in everywhere in Boston, so even though I managed to sneak into Building 10 and witness the inspiration for the Institute's seat of power, I had to content myself with just the exterior of the Minutemen's stronghold. Port Independence has existed in some form or another since as early as the 1630s, what with how this spot overlooks the entrance to Boston Harbor so effectively. It was set on fire during the Revolutionary War, but rebuilt. and was an important defensive installation during the War of 1812. It's been a symbol of American resilience for centuries, so it's another one of those tidy little historical parallels to have Fallout 4's Minutemen moving back into the fort and restoring it. The view from the fort is spectacular, but it feels equally as fantastical to imagine big, tall-masted sailing ships bearing British troops from overseas as it is to picture the Mirelurk Queen rising up out of the choppy water. The fun in the fiction is how Fort Independence threads through all of those eras, the distant and strange past, the comfortable present, and the theoretical speculative future of monsters and radiation, all while maintaining the same symbolic meaning to the structure itself. That kind of consistency is compelling. Really, with the incredible degree of fidelity to the proportions and organization of Boston that Fallout 4 has, the primary thing that's missing is that sense of rot and ruin. Even as a 300-year-old naval fort, Fort Independence is well maintained and clean. Boston's urban core is far too dense and far too expensive to tolerate disuse and decay. Even Boston's poorer neighborhoods are fiercely competitive in terms of commercial and residential space. A person has to radiate outwards into deeper Massachusetts for that kind of thing, with a couple of odd, fascinating exceptions. In the late 1800s, Boston created a series of interconnected public parks collectively referred to as the Emerald Necklace. These parks go off towards the southwest of Boston, where they culminate in the enormous and beautiful Franklin Park. Franklin Park and the others were designed by Frederick Olmsted, the same guy who designed New York Central Park. Franklin Park isn't nearly as famous, though, and is visited infrequently enough to contain the ruins of recreation's past. These strange little stone ruins were designed by Olmsted himself as a changing room and viewing platform for the sports fields below. That's why they're still called the Overlook Ruins, though no plaque marks them. If you come across them just by way of exploration, they have no context at all. Across the athletic fields, on the other side, is arguably the most Fallout feeling of all the Boston landmarks actually within the city itself, an abandoned wing of the Franklin Park Zoo where they used to keep the bears and the badgers. Built in the 1910s, the zoo was free to all visitors as part of Olmsted's vision for building community through nature. It was popular, but by the 1930s it was underfunded and in decline. In 1958, the zoo modernized, built a fence around itself, and charged for-profit admission. Whatever fell beyond the fence line of the new zoo was left to rot, including these cages. The Art Deco touches are what really sells it. This relief of bears at the back of the cage is more than just a reminder that this used to be a zoo. They're a reminder that recreation used to be considered a civic good. It's an image that highlights and deepens a person's sense of the passage of time between eras. Fallout does this all the time. It's just harder to find when the likeliest thing to happen to a 100-year-old abandoned zoo is that they get torn down and someone puts up a TJ Maxx in their place. The surrounding neighborhood, Jamaica Plain, has proven pretty resistant to that kind of change in general. If you get off at the Green Street station along the Orange Line, one way leads to Franklin Park ruins, and the other way leads to the main commercial district of Jamaica Plain. It's a neighborhood with a very strong identity that comes from years of fighting off attempts to pave through or over the community. With immigrant roots going back to the 19th century, Jamaica Plain has had to suffer from neglect and racist policies like redlining in the past. A proposal in the 1970s would have put the I-95 freeway right through the center of the neighborhood. The traditional architecture of Jamaica Plain is preserved in the Summer Hill Historic District. Although it's had hard times, the area has experienced considerable revitalization the past few years, becoming a deeply liberal district of artists, academics, and longtime residents. It's odd, but people still cautioned me against coming here, which is such a peculiar and dated prejudice to have about the place. I never felt unsafe anywhere I went in the city. On the contrary, I was more likely to feel underdressed and uninvited than I was to feel anxious about my safety. Boston is snooty and expensive, and those two things define the city much more than any South Boston grit. If you go instead to the north, you reach one of Boston's most famous satellite communities, Salem, Massachusetts. I was lucky enough to arrive in time for their Halloween festivities to be in full swing. In Fallout 4, the Salem Witch Museum is one of the most memorable side locations, with the Deathclaw in the basement. The museum itself is interestingly modern. There's an antique sensationalist part with mannequins and canned narration, and then after that is a pretty thoughtful museum dedicated to debunking myths about witchcraft and telling stories of some of the many women of colonial and Revolutionary-era Massachusetts who lived lives of rebellion and self-definition. The whole town of Salem is partially oriented around this seasonal tourist influx, though Salem is famous enough that the Witch Museum does daily tours year-round, and the Witch City Mall stays open for visitors in any season so they can go home with a pack of tarot cards and a henna tattoo. For a more sedate, traditional Outer Boston experience, one can always take the freeway down to Quincy. Quincy's nice enough, but I didn't feel like it was worth more than a drive-through. Enough to see that in trying to maintain the proportions of the downtown core of Boston, the game map had to wildly rein in the size of Boston's satellite communities. Quincy in Fallout 4 is like 5 blocks long, if that, whereas in real life it's a few square miles of suburban living, houses and apartments and grocery stores. The place to go near Quincy for a genuine Fallout experience is the quarries outside of town. First cut for granite to supply the stone needed for the Bunker Hill Monument back in the day, dirt from the Underground Freeway project much later was dumped into the ponds of the quarries, filling up their depths and allowing climbers to access the jagged little peaks that long effort had left behind. It's art and graffiti that has become the primary reason to visit the quarries in the years since. The whole place is a giant, collaborative, open-air canvas. When the quarries were deeper, a lot of people died from cliff jumping. The place is so peaceful now, it's hard to picture it as being so many people's final visit to anywhere, seeking a thrill and finding oblivion instead. Perhaps the graffiti preserves some of this spirit of recklessness to throw off some of the rules of rational living and feel free, either freedom through that moment of weightless rushing air as a person dives off the cliff face, or freedom through self-expression, turning a neglected and forgotten place into something that speaks. The Quincy Quarries Reservation is surprisingly large. Granite was the whole town's main source of income for a lot of decades before the modern era. The aggregate effect of the graffiti is quite beautiful and striking. There's a joyfulness to it that places like this can sometimes lack. It's a place of anarchy and rebellion that way, against a society that normally wouldn't allow such free expression, against the anger and callousness that can come from being alienated from such a society. Quarries are, today, genuinely about community. They're quite an artistic achievement. The main ones are just off the parking lot, but if you walk across the street to the tree line, you'll find a quarry that's much closer to how they used to look when they were still more raw granite than paint, closer to how they'd be in the game. Fallout 4 moves its quarries closer to Salem instead of Quincy and presents them in a more modern, industrialized context, but if you want the Fallout experience of wandering through a lawless, abandoned place, the Quincy Quarries Reservation is more or less bound to scratch that itch. They're not that creepy, though, unlike Fallout 4's Dunwich Borers. For creepy, you want to head out to Medfield instead. On the game's map, Medfield would be smack in the middle of the glowing sea, but on the actual Massachusetts map, it's home to a sprawling, abandoned psychiatric complex that, instead of being fenced off and sealed away, was just boarded up and turned into a gigantic off-leash dog park. It's just about the most absolutely bizarre juxtaposition of the creepy and the domestic that I think I've ever seen. There are other, much more intimidating and oppressive former mental institutions out there. We're coming up on one in the Fallout 76 section, as a matter of fact, but the way they're all shuttered and boarded shut is extremely disconcerting here at Medfield. I'm not much of a ghost person, but it's basically no leap at all to wonder if perhaps the boards and barricades were equally useful for keeping something trapped inside. I knocked on one of the doors to satisfy my curiosity, but other than looking foolish, nothing happened. It's just a public park that was once home to thousands of mental patients for 110 years from 1892 to 2003. What's frightening isn't the patients themselves, of course, but the institution as a whole. There was a tremendous amount of cruelty involved in the running of state mental institutions in the old bad days. Women particularly suffered within the system because they could be committed by husbands or fathers for nothing more than behaving in a way that was contrary to what was expected of them, namely to be meek or subservient. Once institutionalized, up until after the 1950s, doctors couldn't just set these women free. They had to be checked out by the one who checked them in. Children born within an institution were raised within it, never to join the rest of society for no reason at all besides suspicion of their heritage as a child of illness. Things were a lot different around here in 2003 than they were in 1892, for the better, but still, all those years of imprisonment and suffering, that's the thing that leaves the stain. That's the thing that makes these places frightening. Before it was a public park, Medfield was often the last stop for some people's whole lives, which were then lived entirely within the campus of 50 or so buildings. That is a kind of existential nightmare it seems reasonable to try to board up and forget about. Maybe I don't believe in ghosts, but I sure believe in bad vibes, and the vibes at Medfield are extremely sour and strange and rancid. Fallout 4 includes something like Medfield with the Parsons State Asylum, but for gameplay purposes it was better to have one building, so Medfield's open campus style doesn't make an appearance. This is one instance, then, where the real-life abandoned asylum is considerably larger and weirder than its in-game counterpart. Going off-map with Fallout 4 can yield some really impressive fruit. To the east of Boston is mostly ocean, but some of the state continues to jut out that direction. I didn't find time to take a ferry to Spectacle Island, although I could have. and Fallout 4's eastern boundary effectively ends at Quincy, yet I was frustrated from my failure at Fort Independence to get inside the structure and get that beautiful bean footage. Across the Boston Harbor Islands from Spectacle Island is a town that kind of curves backwards towards Boston. Hull, Massachusetts. At the top of Hull's only hill is Fort Revere Park. There's been a fort on this hill since the Revolutionary War, but they never see much use. It was sleepy and boring during the War of 1812, sleepy and boring during the Civil War, sleepy and boring during the First World War, and even more sleepy and boring during the Second World War. By that point, the army just gave up and abandoned the place. If you've noticed that it looks surprisingly similar to Baltimore's Fort Armistead, good eyes on you. They were both part of the same era of defense spending under the command of a fellow named William Endicott. In 1885, Grover Cleveland used his presidential powers to create a joint Army-Navy Board of Fortifications with Endicott in charge. From when it was established in 1885 to 1905, the Board of Fortifications established coastal artillery defense stations all across both American coastlines, all in this signature architectural style. Fort Revere is much smaller than Fort Armistead. The tunnels don't go very deep at all. But then again, the thing about Fort Revere is that it was never all that useful as a base in the first place. If it weren't for its historical value, this would be prime real estate for summer homes and Airbnbs. Hull and the surrounding islands are absolutely gorgeous. You can actually see the Boston skyline in the distance, but it feels like an entirely different state out here on the far eastern tip of Massachusetts. By far, the grandest ruin that I saw on my trip was an entirely different state. Because it's the same general kind of landscape, I feel it is more appropriate to Fallout 4 than 3, but on my way between Maine and Maryland, I drove west into the Catskill Mountains along the border between Massachusetts and New York, towering above the Hudson River Valley. Just north of the town of Woodstock, famous for its two contrasting music festivals, is a place called Overlook Mountain. You can't drive to its peak, at least not all the way. Because of this isolation, time has preserved the skeletal remains of the Overlook Mountain House, once a grand and luxurious retreat for wealthy New Yorkers, like so much of the Hudson River Valley back in the 19th century. You hike up the old carriage roads, where horses steadily pulled the richest asses in Manhattan up one of the most draining ascents in the Catskills. It is seriously exhausting. The trail never becomes excessively steep, but it never levels out or dips once either. It is always climbing steadily upwards toward Overlook Mountain's namesake. It was Halloween, and I didn't want to spend it any other way than hiking up to an abandoned luxury hotel at sunset. On arrival, the Overlook Mountain House couldn't be more picture perfect. It had every single touch that I absolutely adore in a Hollywood-style haunted house kind of environment. The elegant stone steps strewn with dirt and leaves, the weeds lying dead in the overgrown fountain, the fireplace with no difference now between it and a raw campfire, open to the elements, the smoke blackening the stone where it can't escape up the ruined chimney. It is so absolutely massive for a ruin like this, 5 stories tall on the slope side. This is the third, never-finished iteration of a series of hotels that have occupied this spot since the 1830s. The bulk of this 300-room hotel was first constructed in 1871. It burnt down twice after that, once in 1875, again in 1921. The new owners pledged never again and used reinforced concrete that made the walls so sturdy as to still be standing now the way they were back in the day. But the new hotel was never finished. It was close to being done in 1928, but by 1940, the owners just flat out gave up and let it molder. It even caught fire again as a ruin, but the tough concrete was unaffected. A smaller guest house exists behind the main hotel with a modern antenna array of some kind keeping it company. There is still such a grandeur to this burnt and hollowed ruin. It truly is skeletal, all outline, no substance, no core besides some staircases and a fireplace. Porcelain bathtub still lies in the lower level of the smaller building. While this era of architecture is a few generations before the atomic age and the invention of the bomb, it really couldn't get more Fallout than this if it tried in terms of vibe. It's a tremendous hike to an absolutely unforgettable, colossal tombstone to the Hudson River Valley's lost heyday of tourism and class. The trail goes further, too. The peak of Overlook Mountain is over 3,000 feet above the town of Woodstock. The Overlook Mountain Fire Tower takes you an extra 100 or so feet into the air, if you're brave enough, which I'm sorry to say that I was not. Built between 1902 and 1950, these things are old, creaky, and the wind blows through their metal lattice with a fierce power. I made it up a few flights before deciding it was too late in the evening to become paralyzed with fear. I have a pretty bad fear of heights. Keep that in mind for later. The view was incredible, but the cost in anxiety was high. For me, the better vista is at the end of the trail. It's just a short walk from the fire tower, nearly as high up, not remotely as spooky. What it looks like is something out of a painting. The smooth, low stone outcropping is framed by the woods until it opens up, revealing the entirety of the Hudson River Valley. It is so jaw-droppingly beautiful in every direction. It is the full Catskills panorama. So in just one hike up the carriage roads, we've got the skeleton of a 300-room luxury hotel, an authentic antique fire watch tower, and a vista so perfect and so spectacular that I was slightly unsure if it was even real or if I was hallucinating it. Overlook Mountain truly has it all in terms of Fallout-style adventure. The only problem is that it isn't anywhere even remotely close to the actual Fallout 4 map. Within the Boston area itself, trying to find one-for-one representations, it becomes important to take what you get and be grateful that it's there at all when it comes to Fallout tourism. This is Bedford Depot Park. The Bedford train station is a pretty small location within the grand scheme of things in Fallout 4, but the Depot Park makes kind of a cool stop because of how it illuminates how much of the connections between Boston and the surrounding area changed over time. Once, the railroad was an important artery, but then came streetcar service, and then passenger cars, and then concrete roadways for the passenger cars, and the Bedford station wasn't needed anymore. Hell, all passenger service had stopped by 1933. In summer months, they occasionally opened the vintage train car as a museum, but while I was there, all I could do was appreciate it from the outside. A more Fallout kind of experience would be to go out towards Clinton instead. Here you'll find what was once the longest train tunnel in Massachusetts, now completely abandoned. The Boston and Maine Railroad built it, which is the same line that ran through Bedford Station. The tunnel is apparently closed now for stabilizing and restoration. These raw rock walls have become a little fragile and unstable over time. To avoid tragedy and try and incorporate the ruin into civic life again, the renovations are being done with a mind to making the tunnel part of a large-scale bicycle trail program. It's a little creepy in the tunnel, but mostly it's just a lot of fun to feel the cold wind, slop around in the mud, and behold the immense variety of artistic styles that can be used to portray human genitals. Leaving the tunnel back towards the road, I was struck by how truly beautiful a place that it was. It makes sense, what with the nuclear apocalypse and all, for the Fallout 4 map not to be verdant and colorful this way. I'm not so petty as to fault the game for that. But actual Massachusetts can be so intensely scenic that the game can sometimes come up really short against it. Clinton isn't far off the edge of the Fallout 4 map, whose western boundary is Natick. On my way back to the city, I stopped off at Lake Cochituate, but I had lingered in the tunnel too long and the gates were closed and locked. The view from the road had to do. The road goes back to Boston, but instead of following the road, the most fascinating thing a person can do from Lake Cochituate is to follow the pipeline instead. This water has been redirected to parch the thirst of Boston for over 100 years, all thanks to the effort of some of the most enormous engines that the industrial age could produce. This large, impressive building is the Boston Metropolitan Waterworks Museum, which may not sound interesting, but in actuality, behold, the exact kind of early 20th century, 19th century industrial design that looks so good covered in rust and fallout. The waterworks no longer runs its engine except very occasionally to keep them from seizing, but they weren't installed in so many different styles of engine right next to each other as a museum exhibit. They're right where they've always been. When new pumps were installed, the old ones were retained as backups and for extra volume of flow when needed. The oldest, smallest pump is from way back in 1887, and the largest, grandest one is from 1898. You can already see the 20th century process of miniaturization at work with how the highest capacity pump is one of the smaller ones, installed in 1922. The whole thing is like a temple to civic horsepower, the grand and beautiful building, with these equally grand, even more intricate machines within it. Most modern infrastructure is meant to be invisible, but the Boston Metropolitan Waterworks is from an era when the entire endeavor was so novel that it was a matter of pride for the city. The Waterworks Museum is one of the only bits of industrial tourism that I was able to do in Boston. I only had a few days in town and the surrounding area to try to get all of this done, and I had a choice: dig deeper or drive farther. There were certain to be things in Boston I just hadn't looked hard enough to find, or I could start looking afresh on a new Fallout map. All it would take is driving several hundred miles more northeast to the top right corner of America itself and the foggy lands of Bar Harbor, Maine. The one thing that I think is kind of essential to Boston that I never did get around to was the big interstate freeway tunnels going under the city, a project referred to collectively as the Big Dig. The freeway tunnels feature in the game, and the Big Dig's reputation for graft and corruption is given reference with the vault where you find Detective Valentine. The reason for this is that, like everyone else, I fucking hate driving in Boston with the fierce intensity of 1,000 suns. The closest I came to disaster on my entire trip was when an old lady in a brand new Mercedes attempted to merge directly into me, apparently failing to notice 20 goddamn feet of antique rolling iron right next to her. It's not just old biddies either. The same thing that makes the city such a pedestrian wonderland with its tight, winding, revolutionary-era street layout makes it one of the most competitive driving environments in America. Once you begin to roll north, though, all that noise and all that aggression melts away with the population density. New Hampshire only takes 45 minutes or so to get through, and then Maine opens up with its rocky woodlands and short rolling mountains. Fallout 4 makes the suggestion that Far Harbor, actually called Bar Harbor in real life, is a long way off from Boston, but if anything, the game is underselling that distance. Where Point Lookout is relatively convenient to Washington, D.C., it takes a full day's driving to make it out from Boston all the way up the long, winding Maine coastline. The way the land changes is quite beautiful too. It becomes colder, it becomes a more rugged kind of nature, a little greener and a little more hostile at the same time. The highlight of the transition is a grand cliff-top to cliff-top bridge soaring 447 feet over the Penobscot River. It's a very modern type of bridge design where the cables are tucked on the inside, which is actually way more frightening than it has any right to be. On nearly any other bridge, I generally feel protected from careening over the side, but here it's just a very teeny tiny fence stopping me from doing it. For those without a fear of heights and a worn-out steering system, I'm sure it's fine, but it was both a frightening and surreal experience for me, the scaredy cat. The bridge seems so strangely contemporary that it looks wildly out of place in small-town Maine. The actual crossing onto the Bar Harbor landmass, called Mount Desert Island, is much less dramatic. One little, barely elevated roadway, and you're there. For Fallout 4, Far Harbor is an inversion of a lot of things about the main campaign, but the fascinating thing is that there's another layer of inversion unique to comparing it to its real-life counterpart. For the main map of Fallout 4, a huge amount of effort and fidelity was put into making the downtown urban parts of the map conform to the actual proportions of Boston. Once beyond the city core, the map becomes much more distorted, tightening up the distance between things considerably and shrinking down the size of optional neighborhoods to just a few blocks. For Far Harbor, it's these larger general proportions that are the more faithful ones. The layout of the island itself is extraordinarily similar between Fallout 4 and real-life Maine. It's the town that's become shrunk and distorted instead. The town of Far Harbor in Fallout 4 and the town of Bar Harbor have little in common, from aesthetic to layout. The large wharf and pier area from the game simply doesn't exist. This ferry platform is about as close as you get to a dock, and it really just is not that impressive compared to the little ramshackle neighborhood that the game portrays. Then, the actual commercial downtown of Bar Harbor is much more touristy than it is in Fallout, probably just for development time reasons. Why make a bunch of bespoke storefronts when collapsed timbers would work just as well? Bar Harbor, as a town, is somewhat similar to Ocean City, Maryland, except instead of being a playground for children, it's a playground for retirees. Plenty of fishing, plenty of seafood restaurants and other fine dining, cozy vibes, pleasing and pastoral architecture, souvenir shops every 25 feet to make sure your grandkids receive a sweatshirt they'll never wear for Christmas. Bar Harbor has really got it all if you don't enjoy loud noises or fast movement. That's not to say it isn't extremely nice. Nice is the point. They wouldn't be able to charge stadium prices for basic food and drink if it wasn't nice. There's just not so much as a whiff of that Fallout flavor of apocalypse. Nothing is run down, nothing is forgotten. Everything that isn't brand new is, at a minimum, boutique-y. The lucky thing is that the touristy stuff is pretty much confined to Bar Harbor. There's a smattering of museums, hotels, and tour companies across the island at large, but that isn't what defines the island. Just like in Fallout 4, wilderness defines the island. No one in their right mind would ever call it a wasteland, but it's impossible to visit without feeling that familiar sense of adventure and promise on which the whole Fallout experience is built. Acadia National Park doesn't occupy the entire island, just key sections of it, maybe a third or a little more of the total landmass. But Acadia is everywhere you look, even if it's not officially designated as national park land. It's entirely possible and even easy to explore the island in just the ways and to just the same locations as you did in the Far Harbor DLC. Once arriving in Bar Harbor, the first thing you're encouraged to do is pick up an NPC companion, Longfellow. Longfellow's small island with its workshop is called Bar Island in real life, and every day at low tide it's accessible by a land bridge that then slowly disappears when the waters rise again. It's directly off the Bar Harbor downtown, but feels like a world away. As soon as you step off the street and onto the sandbar, the sensations of nature come flooding right in. The scent of the ocean and decaying seaweed, the call of the seagulls, the fluttering of strong wind in your ear, the bright sun and sharp air. There's something almost magical about the temporary crossing. It feels secretive, somehow. The view back across to Bar Harbor illustrates how picture-perfect it is, what an absolute postcard town it's become in years of its popularity as a tourist destination. The trails leading up across Bar Island are equally amazing. Again, if anything, Fallout 4 wildly undersells the splendor of its real-world counterpart. The winding trails don't go too far, though. The island is tiny, whether or not you're talking fiction or nonfiction. The bulk of Acadia National Park is down the road. It's funny what kind of things were adapted for Fallout 4, like this entrance kiosk. This is exactly the way it is in the game. The visitor center itself looks a little different, a little more boxy and modern than it is in the game, but the basic setup with the parking, the kiosk, the pathway, and the visitor center is pretty much one for one to how it is. It's even in the exact location on the fictional island. Surrounding the visitor center are the old carriage roads. Bar Harbor has been a tourist destination for more than a century. Long before the automobile, ships brought rich travelers from down south up here to recreate, creating paths for fine horse-drawn carriages to which they were accustomed. The carriage paths are designed to be pleasant more than they're designed to be efficient. The whole network feels as if from a lost era, one that moved slower and cared more about its surroundings. Even on the modern roadways, you'll occasionally pass underneath some grand old stone bridge that was part of the antique carriage network. From this northern lowland, the land rises towards its tallest peak, the top of Cadillac Mountain. In Fallout 4, this is where Dima's observatory is located, but there's no such thing in real life. The trail that Longfellow shows you is real, however, right down to the stacked cairns marking the path. The trails in Acadia National Park frequently disappear because of the large amount of bare rock surface they end up covering. Blue paint marks and cairns are the only way to keep track of where you're supposed to go next on the trail. It's not hard, but it isn't really a beginner's trail either that way. The amazing thing about making the effort to summit Cadillac Mountain is the ever-increasing field of view. Every time you reach another bold spot on the rocks, there's so much more of the island to take in. From the top of Cadillac Mountain, you can see pretty much everywhere there is to go. You can see Bar Harbor to the northeast, Otter Point to the southeast. You can even see over towards Southwest Harbor and the Cranberry Islands. I wasn't able to see the Cranberries because you need a ferry to get there. I arrived at the end of the season and the ferries were no longer running. Besides, I only had 2 days. The Cranberry Islands are real, though, off in the choppy waters to the south. An observatory would be amazing up here, but the views themselves are quite enough. Cadillac Mountain is the trail to take in Acadia National Park if you want the full panorama, though it's hardly the only amazing trail for that kind of thing. Across the division between the right and left halves of the island is Beach Mountain, a smaller summit, but one with an authentic vintage fire watch tower at the top. The tower isn't as tall as the ones in Fallout 4, and the actual room at the top is locked up, but it's still a cool thing to feel your boots on the old metal lattice of the staircase and the wind in your hair. What impressed me the most about the Beach Mountain hike was simply the quality of the trail. In many ways, it's even more scenic than the Cadillac Mountain Trail. You can also loop it, making it so that every step shows you something new. It's out here where a person can truly understand why Bethesda chose this part of the country for its DLC. They wanted somewhere rugged and strange, somewhere that feels truly distant. It's hard to get more distant than this. It's about as far east as it's possible to go on the American continent. Only Canada's Nova Scotia and Newfoundland extend further into the Atlantic. It's got a natural magnificence to it that is so unique to this particular part of the world. Add the fog and the radiation of the Fallout universe, and you've got a recipe for mystery and intrigue. Even the basic Forest Service infrastructure on the island can have a wild mystery to it. In the Fallout DLC, it's not hard to reach the landmass where the Rayburn Point map marker is, but in real life, it's not really connected by anything and is largely private land. So I wanted to get close, anyway, driving to a little cove on the main island that would look across to where Rayburn Point would be. The driveway was closed, so I just parked and walked around the barrier, making my way through the woods to the shoreline. A picnic gazebo peeked out through the trees and I made my way to it, not realizing that it was also the path down to the rocky, sandless shoreline. The steps leading there were old, worn, closed for the season. There wasn't a single soul around. It was such a special, secretive moment in memory for me. I had come here to see if it was like Fallout 4. I had discovered instead a place much more wild and wonderful than even that. Bar Harbor as a DLC doesn't just get the broad strokes right, though. Outside of the town of Bar Harbor, there are actually quite a few minor landmarks and buildings that were translated into the fictional game map. The Cliff's Edge Hotel, for example, is mostly made up. That particular spot is within the national park boundary, but it does have a basic resemblance to the Regency Hotel along the coast outside of Bar Harbor. I think I saw the hotel in the very last season it even was the Regency. It was bought out this year by Holiday Inn. Once upon a time, the Regency was modern luxury, but it's been dated and threadbare for a long time, and now the Holiday Inn designation is an admission of how far it's fallen. For the Harbor Grand Hotel, down towards Southwest Harbor, there also isn't much of anything on that exact spot. Maybe the Astiku Inn, But the look of that one is wrong. The closest parallel to the Harbor Grand is here, tucked into Southwest Harbor, the Claremont Hotel. The style and look of the place feels extremely in keeping with the Harbor Grand. It's got the same kind of architecture and the same lingering impression of pretension and wealth. Both hotels are very close to where their fictional counterparts are and have more than a passing resemblance, so I feel confident enough in figuring those to be the source material. Something that's fully real in every way is the Oceanarium. The Oceanarium was actually closed for a number of years with its future in doubt, but has recently reopened mid-revitalization, letting in folks to see the lobsters and urchins while they figure out how to repair the still-abandoned seal enclosure. The Oceanarium is actually one of the very first things a person encounters driving onto the island, but Fallout omits the exit road, making the environment feel more closed and complete. In this smoothing out, the game relocated the Oceanarium to the other shoulder of the island. It's a non-profit education center now, so if you're doing some Fallout tourism, it wouldn't hurt anyone to drop in and support some local conservation efforts. Plus, you can make a lobster friend, which is neat. The in-game Brooks Head Lighthouse is, in reality, the Bass Harbor Lighthouse. The funny thing is that Bethesda did the same thing here that they did in Point Lookout. They took the squat 3-story house-like lighthouse architecture that actually exists in both locations and turned them into more visually appealing spire-style lighthouses. The Bass Harbor Lighthouse is mostly notable for what a beautiful spot it sits in. The color contrast between the reddish-brown of the rocks and the angry dark blue of the Atlantic Ocean is so absolutely gorgeous, and it doesn't resemble any coastline that I've seen before elsewhere. There's rocky beaches anywhere you go, but not quite these colors, not quite these shapes. There's something truly special about Acadia that way, the thing that makes it a national treasure. Acadia is to Fallout 4 what Zion is to New Vegas, a distant and sacred natural place that never lost its wildness once the nuclear war destroyed the tourism industry. The most lovely spot on the island is, for me anyway, Otter Point. I came down this way because this is where, in Fallout, the shipwreck of the MS Azalea is located. It's a good dungeon, but it's a better picnic spot. The short trail goes towards Thunder Hole one way and towards Otter Point along the matching Otter Cliffs the other direction. The view from the cliffs is dramatic, building anticipation for the shoreline to come, and then the shore itself is beautiful rubble. It's the absolute opposite of a California or Florida beach in every conceivable way. This is Maine, land of Stephen King and tricky accents. It's as weird out here as it is scenic, and that's the point. I was a little heartbroken to leave it behind. 2 days was not nearly enough time. This is a week's worth of exploring, at least to truly get everything. Even the roads here are preposterously scenic. All it took was getting out of the city for the adventure to come flooding in through the open windows. Fallout 4's urban focus is interesting from a level design perspective, but only so-so from a traveler's. Far Harbor is a major improvement, but it's not quite all the way towards what I wanted. What I wanted was deeper America, weirder America, the America that's full of shadows and ruins. I guess what I really wanted was West Virginia. Fallout 76 is really fascinating within the scope of this project because, in many ways, it most resembles the actual source material out of this set of games. But it does this on an individual location-by-location basis. The actual shape of West Virginia is completely bizarre, like a malformed yam, a chunky round center and 2 weird tendrils coming out of the top. Fallout 76 doesn't bother with any of that. Bethesda took the state, chucked it in a blender, and then poured it smooth into a rectangular mold. It's completely false. Absolute fiction. They made it up. And yet in doing so, they created a version of West Virginia that's condensed and remixed in a way that makes all the individual elements pop within the context of the open world. The real West Virginia is pretty enormous. There's hours of travel between most of the locations, particularly the ends of those 2 tendrils that go north and east. By abandoning a broader fidelity to the shape of West Virginia, Fallout 76 was able to intensify the suggestion of West Virginia, its colors, and the aesthetic of its mountainous landscape. Let's begin at the beginning then. Vault 76. Like with Vault 101, it's not actually much to do with anything real. So what are the requirements to find an equivalent? It's got to be on a high ridge overlooking the Ohio River with farms and towns and bridges below. Welcome, then, to Wheeling, West Virginia. Once upon a time, the time referenced by all those robber baron towers in the south of the Fallout 76 map, Wheeling was full of all sorts of millionaires and industrialists. Shipping along the Ohio River made it easy to make third-party profits off of passing ships. This abandoned structure, with its grand spiral staircase and magnificent views, was meant to be a gift from a wealthy doctor to his wife. Local legend says that he abandoned it out of heartbreak when she died, which is very romantic, but the fact is that the doctor was brought up on federal drug charges and the property was seized by the county. The view is the important thing. This is the aesthetic that defines the game's starting areas, the Ohio River at a border, the small and crumbling towns, the giant industry and the nuclear power plants, the grand spans of old bridges. It's all literally right here in front of you on the Mount Wood overlook. Directly behind it is another feature you'll likely find familiar from Fallout 76, the ancient town cemetery. There's a few of these in the game, like the Kanawha County Cemetery, but Mount Wood is a fine real-life example with how scenic it is and how old the majority of the gravestones are. These are skeletons from Wheeling's heyday as an Ohio River boomtown. All along the Ohio River, moving down the neck of the state towards the round part, is a mix of natural beauty and extremely heavy industry. I've never seen anything quite like it. Out west, these kinds of factories and refineries and granaries are kept tucked away in the armpits of a given city or county, hidden away from recreation corridors. West Virginia mixes them all together, like they appear in the game. You round a corner of the road or a bend in the river and suddenly, boom, the instantly recognizable smokestacks of a nuclear power plant. This one's called the Mitchell plant. Further down the Ohio River is the Kiger Creek power plant. The atom is alive and well and very active out here in West Virginia. People have lived in this part of the world for a very long time, before there was ever even an America, though. This is the Grave Creek Mound, from which the town of Moundsville takes its name. It is a 2,000-year-old burial mound from a prehistoric native people called the Adena. Moundsville used to have quite a few more, but they were all plowed under back before any kind of conservation effort could be organized. The archaeological center was closed while I was there, unfortunately. Across the street, I mean literally across the street, is a building that you are sure to recognize. In Fallout 76, it's called the Eastern Regional Penitentiary. Here in Moundsville, it's just called the West Virginia Penitentiary. The tours were 2 hours, and we were 10 minutes late for one, so my friend Nate and I made the choice to keep moving down the road. Still, there are some exhibits open without taking the guided tour, like this wall of weapons. Law enforcement exhibits around Ohio and West Virginia have a tendency to be unapologetic and sensationalistic. This museum is no different. They're genuinely really proud of all the folks that were executed here. Still, if you're looking for artifacts on which the many tools of violence available to you in Fallout 76 are based, here you go. The oddest part is the visitors' hall, down a quiet back corridor where prisoners met with visitors and spoke through the phones across bulletproof glass. There's a crumbling piece of artwork back there that's very odd and melancholy. The whole place is just a major bummer, made more so by its enthusiasm for cruel and punitive justice as the good old days. Still, the Gothic architecture sure is something. It's an iconic West Virginia structure, and it's no wonder they put it in Fallout 76. Between Wheeling and Moundsville is a structure, though, even more outrageous. So outrageous, in fact, that I assumed at first that Fallout 76 had made it up entirely. On the Fallout 76 map, it's called the Palace of the Winding Path. Turns out the Palace and the Winding Path are actually two separate things. At the top of a mountain overlooking Wheeling Creek is what's essentially North America's premier Hare Krishna cathedral. This is Prabhupada's Palace of Gold. Prabhupada himself was a leader of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness here in America and created this community, New Vrindavan, as a refuge for his fellow followers of Krishna. Hare Krishna isn't the actual name of the organization, it's just the thing that they chant, which is actually a surprisingly simple thing. They're chanting the name of their supreme deity because they believe that such a thing pleases him. The idea is that Krishna, as an infinite being of sorts, continually reincarnates to experience different aspects of existence, and so it honors Krishna to fill the world with things that Krishna enjoys. Prabhupada was treated in a similar manner. He died before the palace was completed, but it is still in honor and remembrance of him. He has a bedroom and furniture and anything he could want, were it not for him being dead and all. There's no cameras allowed inside, but there's nothing weird in there. It's just a colossal amount of art and decoration crammed into a very tiny space. Their website explains it like this, quote, Prabhupada's palace is not a memorial of mundane love. Its greatness cannot be understood in terms of marble, teak, silver, or gold. Rather, it is a work of unalloyed devotion to Lord Krishna and his pure devotee. No expert architect or experienced artisans were involved. It was built without blueprints by young devotees inspired by their desire to build a modest home for their spiritual master. By God's arrangement, their work was transformed into a labor of love, accepted by him who considers not the gift of the lover, but the love of the giver. End quote. For those who may have lost track, yes, we are still in West Virginia, outside Wheeling and Moundsville. To my eye, this kind of wild cultural diversity here in the heart of coal mining country is fascinating. There isn't a huge amount of love or respect for the Krishnas in the surrounding communities, but they are, at least, tolerated, and what they've built here is truly impressive. While I don't personally find the religious aspect especially appealing, it is apparent that the building is indeed an act of devotion and love, and that's as unusual a quality as anything else about the building. At its peak in the 1970s and 80s, nearly 1,000 people lived and worshipped in New Vrindavan. Today the number is in the low hundreds. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness is, perhaps, too earnest for today's America. So that's the palace, and here's the winding path. The road up from Wheeling up the mountain to the palace is one of the flat-out most beautiful little roads that I have ever taken. Part of it was the season. West Virginia was the first of the Fallout maps that I arrived at coming from the West Coast moving east, and then, briefly, the last place as I came back the other direction. Being there in the middle of October let me see the forest in exactly the same way as it's portrayed in Fallout 76, all golden and red leaves gently falling through the air in gusts and whirls of wind. It was almost worth being in the off-season with so many things closed or with reduced tour hours, simply for this particular flavor of West Virginia landscape. I could hardly believe how close it was to the game, or rather, how well the game is imitative of West Virginia's forests in the late autumn. The roads that wind along Wheeling Creek are like something from a painting. It would take a far more powerful game engine than the one that runs Fallout 76 to even begin to capture the detail. My friend Nate and I could only agree that, yeah, this was in fact almost heaven. Or, like the song says, country roads take me home to a place that's pleasing to Krishna. On the Fallout 76 map, they moved the Palace of Gold far to the east, past Grafton, but it's actually towards the very northern tip of the state. There's even a Fallout location at the absolute northern tip of West Virginia, the Chester Teapot. The game's got the teapot down by Charleston for some reason, but the real teapot is here in what used to be the porcelain capital of America. If you wanted fine tableware, it was East Liverpool, Ohio, and Chester, West Virginia you'd want to go, and the teapot originally sold ceramics before it became a snack, coffee, and souvenir stand. Now it's mostly just a relic, one that's surprisingly small compared to its version in Fallout 76. Another minor location in Fallout 76 is Big Fred's Barbecue, or possibly Toxic Larry's Meat and Go. I'm not sure if it's one, the other, or both, but the root of them seems to be this extremely kitschy tourist trap called Hillbilly Hot Dogs, a ways down the Ohio River from Moundsville. The whole place is just a carnival of dad jokes, Dave Barry jokes, Jeff Foxworthy jokes, and colorful junk of every variety. It is the absolute definition of roadside America, kind of deliberately so, leaning into every single trope it possibly can to attract the attention of passing cars. I didn't get a hot dog myself, possibly because of my strong memories of Toxic Larry's, but I should have. Nate and I didn't make it a hell of a lot farther than that day. We were bound for Point Pleasant in the Mothman Museum, and we got there, but we got there in a tow truck. In over 10,000 miles of continuous travel, the Thunderbird only threw a shit fit and died once, which I consider a resounding success. It was on account of just about the only thing that wasn't replaced before leaving, the gas tank. I imagine most people never think about it, but a rusty gas tank leads to a kind of sediment in the bottom of the fuel. Enough of that sediment gets pulled into the fuel pump, and the fuel pump jams up and fails. Personally, I blame Mothman. This is his town, and he apparently wanted us to stay. Initially, this was an inconvenience and a negative. I had been crossing my fingers against losing time to mechanical trouble, and so far, superstition had been enough. But now, looking back, it's one of my favorite things that happened to me because of just how hilariously West Virginia the whole thing turned out. I don't have an illustration for all of it, so while I tell this story, let's take a look at one of Point Pleasant's oddest civic features. A series of large murals depicting the progression of European settlement in the area by Robert Dafford. They are sometimes very pretty, and sometimes pretty racist, telling a very Eurocentric version of events, mostly relating to the battle against the Algonquin Federation in 1774. History written by the victors and all that. Point Pleasant, before anyone ever muttered the words Mothman, was somewhat significant as a point of conflict for the Revolutionary War, Lord Dunsmore's War, and the Civil War, many of which are depicted here in the murals. I came to this riverside park in the morning, waiting for my fuel pump to be installed by a man named Possum. I have a useful service called AAA, which is like towing insurance with recommended shops. The tow truck driver told me that AAA wanted to take my car to a Chevy dealership. He said they'd probably give me the runaround about a machine this old, and what I ought to do is take it to Possum's Muffler and Brakes. Which seemed like possibly the setup to a nothing but trouble-style horror comedy, but I agreed absolutely that a modern Chevy dealership is not the place to bring a Ford from 1978. I figured a mechanic named Possum was a 50-50 proposition. He was either going to be the nicest guy we ever met, or an actual axe murderer. I couldn't see it going a more moderate way. Possum was, luckily, the former. He did great work, getting us back on the road the following morning for barely more than the price of the part. In the meantime, the only hotel in town that we could get to on foot was the Low, a hotel from 1901 that advertises itself as the most haunted in West Virginia. It's directly across from the Mothman Museum. I hadn't planned to be stuck in what was apparently an extremely haunted hotel while a man named after a rodent fixes my ancient car and I kill time by going to a museum about a cryptid, but there you go. All those things came together for me at the exact same time, a magical conjunction only possible in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Mothman fever runs deep in Point Pleasant. He's their biggest celebrity. Interestingly, Fallout 76 itself has done a huge amount to revitalize that interest. The Mothman Museum was piping a Fallout Spotify playlist through their outdoor speakers, and they have a lot of Fallout-adjacent merch on the inside. The gift shop is honestly the actual purpose of the Mothman Museum. It's no larger than it is in Fallout 76, just a couple rooms filled with literally every single piece of Mothman errata or memorabilia it's humanly possible to find. I'm no more enthusiastic about conspiracy theories than I am about ghosts, but I'm very willing to be entertained by this Art Bell coast-to-coast AM type stuff. Things where it's so over-the-top and chaotic that there's no real expectation that anyone will take it seriously. The ticket to the Mothman Museum is valued at $5, but it's the t-shirt you bring home that's the real treasure. Next to the museum is the Mothman statue, which I love with all my heart because not only did they go hard on the design, the artists spent what seems like a great deal of effort making sure that Mothman has what can only be described as a seriously rockin' ass. Look at this taut son of a bitch! Fallout 76 made Mothman very mysterious and creepy, but I wonder now if this is because they simply lacked the courage to make him swole. Point Pleasant is a small and surreal little town. It doesn't take long to see what there is to see, but it'll be an extremely long time before I ever stop thinking about it. The first town a player usually reaches in Fallout 76 is Flatwoods, which is a real town but didn't quite make the cut for this video. Unlike Massachusetts and Maryland, the distance between in-game landmarks on the actual West Virginia map can range from dozens to hundreds of miles. It's not huge, it's a medium kind of state, but it is considerably more territory than either Fallout 3 or 4. Flatwoods itself is both on the other side of the state and equally as small a town as it's portrayed in the game, possibly even smaller. For this western, low-level, Ohio River-adjacent part of the state and game map, the last major location that's actually where it's supposed to be on the game map is Camden Park. In the game, it stands on the border between the early zones and the Ash Heap, a fictional kind of landscape that takes coal country to a blasted, uninhabitable extreme. There's nothing actually like the Ash Heap to be found outside of a volcanic environment. Camden Park is real, however. It's about the same size as it's depicted in the game, too. The only problem is that it is only open on Saturdays, and the cantankerous parking lot security guard was very against the idea of us being there at all. So I'm sorry to say that I'm unsure whether Drostos has a direct equivalent. It looks like there might be. The whole vibe seems extraordinarily similar. Less than 10 minutes from Camden Park is the town of Kenosha, with the Kenosha Pumpkin House. Even though Halloween was just a couple weeks away, the pumpkins weren't actually out. Nate and I could see folks preparing them around the back of the building, but for us it was the Kenosha Anticlimax House. I'm not really sure why they moved it in the game. I guess because the pumpkins aren't on theme for the Ash Heap, but they are on theme in the Scorch Beast-infested northern mountains. In the pumpkin house's place, Fallout 76 decided to place the entire town of Beckley. Beckley is indeed one of the most famous mining towns in West Virginia, but it's actually in the center of the state along the New River Gorge. Beckley's relocation to the Ash Heap makes plenty of sense because of its main attraction, the Beckley Exhibition Coal Mine. While primarily just a workshop location in the game, the actual mine tour is a very authentic glimpse into West Virginia's past and present as the coal mining state. The museum you can walk around waiting for your tour to start is interesting enough, full of all sorts of arcane tools and artifacts from the early days of mining. The most compelling part of the museum is the workers' quarters. There's a small cabin that was intended for single men, no bigger than a closet. Families could rent this larger house, which is nice enough, but the key word here is rent. On the table of the house, laminated to protect it, is an actual miner's pay stub. On it, for 4 weeks of dangerous, grueling work, the mine decided that the worker owed them about 25 cents. A month of your life. More, really, on account of the lung damage from the rock dust, for the price of negative 1/4. The company nickel and dimed the workers for everything. Every meal, every night's sleep, every candle, every bar of soap, every tool, including dynamite for use in the mines. This, in contrast, is the boss's house. The boss is compensated by the mine very well and does not pay rent on this expansive 2-story home. Or didn't, anyway. Once on the mine tour itself, our guide turned out to be one of the former workers. He was incredibly likable, warm and wry, full of the kind of dark ironies that Fallout is known for. West Virginia is largely Republican, Trump country, but I have to say that I've never met a miner who wasn't vehemently anti-corporate. Coal miners, and other miners in industries like iron, have always been on the front lines of the push and pull of power between employee and employer. In the 1800s and early 1900s, corporations were allowed to mistreat, overcharge, and underpay their workers on a pretty broad basis. This was maintained as essential to their bottom line and that there was no other way to make a profit. It costs blood to mine coal. Nothing you can do. Might as well not even try. Miners eventually banded together and demanded changes in safety and changes in compensation. Company scrip was no longer allowed. They had to be paid in real American cash. Work quotas would have to take second place to safety considerations. This legacy of collective action is why miners have such a strong sense of shared interest and identity today. What they have, they fought for. The whole set of rules by which modern mine safety is regulated was paid for by thousands of dead miners. It took nearly 100 years to make things better, so they are reluctant to let that go. When coal is ignored or deprioritized, even for reasons of environmental conservation, the miners tend to react defensively and collectively toward that threat the way they have to other threats to their community in the past. It doesn't quite fit in well with either a left or a right perspective. It's more of a kind of occupational tribalism, reinforced by so many generations of suffering and conflict with the companies who actually profit from the coal. The danger of mining is constant and intense. Take, for example, fossilized stumps of trees that once made up the swampland forests from which the coal eventually emerges. These petrified stumps are indistinguishable from the surrounding rock until they become dislodged and fall, striking a miner's head with the force of a falling boulder. That kind of work produces a hard, insular subculture. One that's built on sacrifice and pride, though, which is why West Virginia is so invested in honoring its coal miners. The coal miner occupies a special place right outside the state capital in Charleston. This statue honors no miner in particular, but the whole spirit of the enterprise, their bravery and persistence. Appalachia has a reputation for poverty, and in many counties this is somewhat accurate, West Virginia history largely being the story of a place where the divide between rich and poor is immense and deep. The way Fallout 76 portrays the new robber barons in their stilted mansions riding high above the workers down below on their private monorail system is based off of the social dynamics that have been present in the state since the very beginning of the industrial age. Charleston wasn't always the capital, for example. Wheeling was. Twice. The designation of state capital ping-ponged back and forth between Wheeling and Charleston 3 times in 2 decades, in 1870, in 1875, and again in 1885. Wheeling was where the money was. But it was at the extreme corner of the state. Charleston is truly central and qualifies as just about the only city in the state. And even that's kind of pushing it. Charleston has a few very modest skyscrapers, the verticality of an urban downtown, but the whole capital is over and past in 2 freeway exits. It rests on the edge of the Kanawha River in a pleasant little strip. The way the land uplifts to the south from there in the game is like it is in real life. The city occupies a nice flat spot in an otherwise very mountainous region, and across the river the land begins to immediately climb. Surprisingly, the main complex of the Charleston capital is open to the public. You have to pass through security, but otherwise, so long as you remain quiet and respectful in what is a lot of people's work environment, you can tour at your leisure and without a guide. At least in the main corridors to the rotunda, which is plenty enough really. It would be very awkward to fling open a random office door with a video camera and loudly yell, "Wow, just like the video game!" Thing is, look at the place. It genuinely is just like Fallout 76 portrayed it, down to the location of the staircases. The West Virginia Capitol was designed by someone very famous, Cass Gilbert, pioneer of the modern skyscraper. Gilbert became famous for designing the Woolworth Building in New York, and his fame brought him all over the country as a celebrated architect. So the result here is something that was, for the early 1900s, spectacularly and impressively modern, classy from the gilded dome down to the signature on the blueprints. An entire 2/3 of the interior is done up with glossy, expensive marble. Point being, this is not the seat of power for an impoverished state. It was the best building that money could buy from one of the country's leading architects. In a funny coincidence, Cass Gilbert even received his degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There are huge sections of West Virginia that struggle every day with things like food precarity and job availability, but West Virginia has always had a strong, tightly defended undercurrent of extreme and extractive wealth. It's that influence that built the capital. The West Virginia coal miner might get a statue out front, but all those wages that never made it into the miners' pockets are reflected here in the gleaming marble halls of the Capitol complex instead. The brightest, gaudiest jewel of West Virginia wealth is, of course, the Greenbrier Resort. In Fallout 76, it's called the White Springs, likely in honor of how the town it's in is called White Sulphur Springs. It's existed in some form since 1778 as a retreat and resort for East Coast elites, but the current hotel complex was largely built in 1913. This longevity in history is important because it means when the U.S. Defense Department created their secret bunker within its walls and basements, it really was a hell of a secret. It wasn't, "Come stay at the brand new, completely unsuspicious Bunker Acres Resort." The Cold War additions were placed within an already famous, already well-traveled place. Called Project Greek Island, the bunker was intended to be the seat of new government in the event of Washington D.C.'s destruction and a nuclear attack. Senators and congressmen and their families came to the Greenbrier all the time already. They had since the days when William Howard Taft was president. The cover was actually ridiculously clever in how it not only concealed the bunker, but the movements to and from the bunker from close watchers. There is a tour of the bunker, but unfortunately I wasn't able to make it. If you go, call in advance about that and make sure you can get in on it. What stunned me about the Greenbrier is that based only on what I remember about Fallout 76, I was immediately able to navigate the whole Maine hotel. The shops are exactly where they are in the game, down the stairs and to the right. A shockingly huge number of details, like the odd and loud wallpaper carpet combinations, were translated from the Greenbrier over to the White Springs. Even the golf course. In real life, all the dirt from the bunker excavation was used to create and contour the golf courses, meaning no trucks full of sediment ever left the property. It wasn't until 1992 that the Washington Post figured out that the bunker was there, and then once it was public, the government immediately abandoned it and turned it over to the resort as a museum piece. It was outdated by that time anyway, and besides, a secret seat of government is most useful when it's actually a secret. Consider, though, what the look of the Greenbrier and the presence of the bunker means. It costs hundreds of dollars a night to stay here. Nate and I parked across the street and walked in when we visited. We initially tried to drive up to the hotel, but the security guard politely but firmly insisted that even if we were guests, our vehicle did not meet standards and I would need to be parked elsewhere. Which I found a little presumptuous. I mean, by that point in my trip, my exhaust pipe hadn't even broken in two. Point being, there is a standard at the Greenbrier, and that's visible, demonstrable wealth. If you don't have it, you can still roam the halls and have an ice cream, but you are not truly welcome there. The Greenbrier prices itself the way it does, so many times higher than even luxury hotels in Manhattan, to create exclusivity. It is self-selecting. You wouldn't spend that kind of money on this kind of thing unless that money was extremely disposable to you. The Greenbrier has been, for years, a kind of secondary seat of government for the state of West Virginia as a whole. Charleston is where the politics are performed in public and money is allocated in budgets. The Greenbrier is where politics are performed privately, in backrooms and staterooms, across isolated tables in the lounge, among deliberately cultivated intersections of the powerful, the wealthy, and those who split the difference. The Greenbrier charges a lot for a room, but it's really nothing compared to the money that's exchanged, millionaire to millionaire, within its halls. It's as surreal a place in West Virginia as it's possible to go, arguably even stranger in ways than Prabhupada's Palace of Gold. There, at least, the object of all the worship and all that gold was Krishna. Here, the only thing anyone seems to worship is the gold itself. West Virginia as a landscape is far older than any of what humans have built on top of it, of course. The mountains of West Virginia were created across 3 ancient epochs when the land was mostly drowned in water. The mountains uplifted first during the Ordovician period, creating the long backbone of eastern mountains, the ones which in Fallout 76 separate the beginning areas from the endgame swamps and fields of Watoga. The second created the mountains around Harper's Ferry during the Devonian period. Then the third, the Appalachian orogeny, created further mountain uplift 290 million years ago when this continent collided with Africa. Near the Greenbrier are the Lost World Caverns, a small glimpse into these unimaginably distant geologic eras. The limestone deposited here when this was once an ocean has eroded into a short but spectacularly decorated cave. Fallout 76 even preserves the distance between Lost World Caverns and the Greenbrier, putting them on the map side by side as Uncanny Caverns instead. The caverns genuinely are right outside of Lewisburg. Even the little crooked hallway that you go down to enter them actually exists. The only thing it doesn't have from the game is those speaker boxes. The actual caverns, if you go early enough or in the off-season enough to find yourself alone down there, is wonderfully quiet. All you hear is very occasionally the dripping of water. The colored lighting works well, but unlike its Skyline caverns, the cave formations themselves are spectacular and diverse. I much prefer the self-guided over the guided experience. That is, after all, the Fallout way. Like most caves, there is an option to go deeper on a wild cave tour, but that requires being a little smaller than I happen to be. Lost World Caverns has an interesting history because, for many years, it was a local trash chute. A big hole in the ground to dump dead cattle and moldy timber. It wasn't until the 1940s when actual scientists expressed curiosity about the place. If it was left to the farmers, it's hard to say if it would have ever been anything more than a cattle disposal drain. Fallout 76 makes its dungeons much larger than the actual cave's public sections, but that's all for gameplay purposes. Lost World Caverns, on their own, is a relatively short, modest stop to make, but it makes up for that in dense decoration. To the north of Uncanny Caverns on the Fallout 76 map is the Vault 76 Overseer's home in Morgantown. This is the fictional location of Vault-Tec University, where the overseers of most of the vaults were trained in the art of corporate sadism. The Vault Tech part is fictional, but the actual Morgantown is home to not only a medium-sized airport, but also West Virginia University. The university, in Fallout 76, takes particular direct inspiration from Woodburn Hall. Along with Chitwood Hall and Martin Hall, these structures arrayed around their square make up the campus that you see in the game. There's no vault, just a series of very nice classrooms and a grand historic building first constructed in 1876. At the back of Woodburn Hall is this amazing patio from which most of Morgantown can be seen, covering the hillsides below. Morgantown itself is out of order with Grafton on the game map. Morgantown's actually the last thing you see of West Virginia before going north towards the Pennsylvania border in Pittsburgh, which is genuinely very nearby. Grafton is actually to the south of Morgantown. I passed through it on my way. Grafton is quite small comparatively, even if it does have a few taller buildings and it's dilapidated and crumbling downtown. Grafton's history and outlook was rosy and optimistic through much of the 19th and early 20th century. During the Civil War, its railroad infrastructure was a point of major contention, instrumental to deploying Union troops throughout the area. The railroads continued to bring in money and prosperity after the war, manufacturing blossomed, and there were plenty of good industrial jobs to be found. Grafton was a major hub of local production. Then, in the mid-century, 3 of its largest factories shut down in rapid succession. The town declined for 30 years until the railroad itself moved, taking the last of Grafton's traditional sources of income away. The town exists now in a hesitant limbo, shrunken from its former proportions and population, surrounded by the rusted reminders of better times. In both Fallout 76 and actual West Virginia, Grafton is powered mostly with hydroelectricity. There's a dam very nearby called the Tigert Dam on which the in-game Grafton Dam is based, but I'm not always that sharp and somehow missed that fact when I was doing my initial research and planning. I got my wires crossed and went, instead, far across the state to the larger Bluestone Dam down by Hinton. On the Fallout 76 map, this would be down in the ash heap. The Bluestone Dam is a massive concrete flood control system for the New River and Greenbrier River. Recent engineering surveys, however, discovered that in the event of truly catastrophic flooding, the dam was pretty much doomed to fail and collapse. For over 10 years, it's been undergoing a refurbishment that raises its overall height by 8 feet and significantly strengthens its anchors and supports. Bluestone Dam is a massive, impressive piece of engineering. It looks too official to be, essentially, built wrong, but it was. It's quite scenic, though, constructed like it is along a southern bend of the New River. I was glad that I ended up making the detour, even if it isn't the correct dam, because of how absolutely classically West Virginia town Hinton ended up being. These kinds of houses and churches, this particular color of brickwork, this level of age and neglect, this is exactly what was translated so lovingly into Fallout 76's world map in all the little houses and businesses that players continually explore and loot across the face of the world map. Even the places that are completely and utterly fictional are still based on an actual plot of land, even if there isn't much to see when you get there. Watauga State Park is the largest of West Virginia's state parks. Rather than a gleaming automated city of the future, a showcase of what labor could be like without laborers, what you've got is actually 10,000 acres of pristinely preserved West Virginia wilderness. Watauga State Park has some signs of wealth. Here, for example, is a gated bridge to some kind of estate right outside the park. But the park itself is too large to be condensed down to a video like this. Theoretically, it would make up the entire Cranberry Bog region of the Fallout 76 map. But the truth of actual West Virginia is that the state ends at the Appalachian Mountains. If the Cranberry Bogs were where they are on the game map, it would be Virginia proper. Except that all those landmarks do exist in West Virginia, all throughout the eastern Allegheny mountain ranges. The game uses the mountains for gameplay organization, a physical barrier to separate the early game from the late game. If it was truer to real life, all 3 of the eastern regions would be jammed up on top of each other. Which is kind of great, actually, because you can drive all the way through the Allegheny or Appalachian Mountains on US 219 or West Virginia 92 and see a known Fallout landmark every half an hour or so. They are all local to each other in the most fascinating of ways in this part of the state. Rather than explore the large expanse of Watauga, Nate and I went instead to the Cranberry Glades Botanical Area. Without the mountains, there would be no cranberry bogs at all. The cranberry bogs are a small and fragile biome, like Maryland's saltwater marshes, that are typically found far to the north in Canada. The height of the Allegheny Mountains and the way they create a colder microclimate has allowed, over time, for the development of these peat marshes, displaced hundreds of miles to the south from where they naturally ought to be. It was especially cold for Nate and I. We caught the first snow of the season when we arrived. The Cranberry Glades have a half-mile boardwalk trail leading around the edge of one of the bogs, crisscrossing a beautiful little stream. The boardwalk actually made it into Fallout 76. The Cranberry Glades is a somewhat small and comparatively quiet part of that region in the game, Not nearly as full of danger as the bizarre post-nuclear cranberry forests of the fictional region. In the game, it's more the traditional West Virginia bog experience to go to the Cranberry Glades, which is cool because if you actually make the journey, the parallel is more immediately clear. This is the fact on which the region's fiction is based in Fallout 76, and the lore doesn't stop there. In the story of Fallout 76, the reason that there's super mutants at all is because the government tested them in the small town of Huntersville. Small is putting it lightly when it comes to Huntersville. It is a zero-stoplight town, just as isolated a hamlet as portrayed in the game. It's on a connecting road in between two of the main byways across the Allegheny Mountains. It wouldn't be hard at all to create a military quarantine if everyone here happened to turn into big green monsters. One truly fascinating thing about these hills is that the radio observatories and science infrastructure scattered across the Savage Divide in the game are not only real, they've created a strange little kingdom in which the observatory's needs override the rest of the surrounding towns. The Green Bank Observatory is the epicenter of the National Radio Quiet Zone, where electromagnetic emissions are kept to a deliberate minimum. Around Green Bank, that minimum is as close to zero as they can get it. This is an entire part of the American continent where cell phone usage is not only disabled, but actively suppressed. The Green Bank Observatory is given total priority over any kind of commerce concerns. Recently, it's become a kind of refuge for Luddites, a place where no one looks at you weird for having a landline because there's actually no other legal way to have a phone out there. Because of how late Nate and I arrived, we couldn't do the tour or get closer than this scale model, but it's not hard to do with better planning. With the snow and the cell phone blackout, Nate and I were concerned about taking the Thunderbird all the way up to the top of Spruce Knob, the tallest mountain in West Virginia. At the time we skipped it, but the snow melted for a brief window on my way back through in November. Spruce Knob in Fallout 76 is the seat of the settler community, added by the NPC updates that the game received later on in its life. They've got this whole big fancy tower up at the top. The actual Spruce Knob is nowhere near so built up. It's the spruce trees that are the main attraction. Like the Cranberry Glades, the mountain is a sky island of colder, more northern plants. In this case, the ancient boreal forest, occupying the mountain's top few hundred feet, the knob part of the mountain. This microclimate is what allows all the spruce trees to grow. The winds here are so fierce that many of these spruce trees become contorted by the wind, giving the place a desolate and slightly blasted kind of look in places. The trail that goes around the rim of the summit provides the best views. Spruce Knob is the tallest mountain not just of West Virginia, but of the entire Allegheny Mountain Range, extending up into Pennsylvania and into 2 other states. Everywhere you look is down. This is West Virginia with maximum draw distance. While I appreciate how natural the mountain is, I would kind of enjoy a big Fallout 76-style observation platform. This is the actual observation platform, just a low stone affair done up in a kind of traditional Parks Department utilitarianism. It needs like an extra 20 to 50 feet to truly do the job of allowing a person to observe the full panorama. As it is, the top of the platform can't actually see over the spruce trees very well. The trail, with how it winds in between bald spots on the long vistas, is the much more scenic option to take. Hundreds of millions of years ago, when the North American plates collided with Africa, Spruce Knob was uplifted from deep under the earth, way below the surface. All that old seabed, suddenly sitting exposed to the winds and rains, eroded it quickly, except for Spruce Knob, a single stony survivor of an ancient and jagged landscape. On the way back down the mountain is an especially gorgeous vista looking down over the byway of US 33 and the towns of Judy Gap and Riverton. All that coal that comes out of the rocky West Virginia soil is a byproduct of the long-lost seabed from the days of Pangea. The accumulated dead of 1 trillion aquatic plants and animals, most of which are extinct, many of which are a complete mystery. That's what's really strange about human time versus geologic time. I feel like 160 years ago, when these hills were contested territory of the American Civil War, when coal was first pulled out of the ground to power the grand old steam engines and factories of the early industrial age, I feel like that's a hell of a long time ago. Almost impossible to picture. But humans will use every bit of coal that's ever existed in West Virginia within 1/10,000th of the time it takes to create that coal all over again. We sit, as a culture, on top of deep time. Picture a frog on a lily pad. Now imagine that there is no shore, and under the frog is a depth of water miles deep, with unknown monsters and crushing pressure down at the bottom. That is our relationship to geologic time. It's unknowable, and it will kill us long before we can ever fully engage with it. Further down the road is another remnant of the ancient sea, Seneca Rocks. This striking cliff face is made entirely out of compacted composite sediment from the vanished oceans of West Virginia's deep geologic past. Like Spruce Knob, everything around it has simply eroded first, leaving it stranded and exposed. All mountains eventually erode away, but tectonic action is constantly creating new mountains to replace them, just at a rate that's so impossibly imperceptibly slow that it has very little bearing on human existence at all. By the time that happens, we won't even be the same mammals anymore. Whatever we are will be many, many, many branches down the genetic tree. Supposing we don't do something hinky to mess it up, that is, like, I don't know, nuke the planet. Seneca Rocks is an important crossroads for the traveler, besides how transparently it floats on top of geologic time. Take US 33 to the west, and you'll reach the heartland of the state. Take West Virginia 28 to the north instead, and you'll head towards Berkeley Springs, Harper's Ferry, and the strange eastern strand of West Virginia that Fallouts 76 reconstructed into a region called the Mire. The Mire is one of the more interesting regions of Fallout 76, a dark and overgrown radioactive swamp, although I do have one complaint. It's a little too dark. You can't see very much. Imagine the irony, then, of arriving at Harper's Ferry a couple hours after sunset and finding it shrouded in a deeper darkness than any of the surrounding towns. The National Park Service keeps the historic downtown of Harper's Ferry at pre-electric light levels, trying to create a dark sky sanctuary for local night fauna. I thought coming here at night there'd still be something to see. There's nothing. Nothing open, no one out, just a very shadowy old place. And this used to be the world. The whole world used to be this dim and dark at night. Harper's Ferry is at the extreme eastern edge of the state. It's only 65 miles from the heart of Washington, D.C., a little over an hour's drive if you get lucky with traffic. There's a commuter train that leads from here right to the city. No wonder then that the first reference to Vault 76 is actually in Fallout 3. The game maps of Fallout 3 and Fallout 76 are much closer to each other than either of them are to Fallout 4's map. Berkeley Springs is also on this eastern spur, but I went south instead, to Front Royal, Virginia, where I visited Skyline Caverns in the morning, pivoting backwards across the state to Spruce Knob and Seneca Falls after that. For me, the Mire remains a little shrouded in mystery. I only had time to traverse it in darkness, which was appropriate enough, I guess. I nearly didn't even make it to the next day's ultimate destination either, but by the skin of my teeth and the generous uphill torque of the old motor in the Thunderbird, I arrived in Weston, West Virginia. No Fallout 76 survey would be complete without the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, featured within the game as Fort Defiance, home of the 1.0 release Brotherhood of Steel faction until they re-headquartered with actual NPCs at Fort Atlas. The Trans-Allegheny Asylum, also called the Weston State Hospital, was open for an astonishing 140 years, spanning from the time before psychiatry even existed as a science in 1864, all the way to 1994, when it was determined that the giant old structure was always more of a prison than a hospital, and would be better off being consigned to history. The Weston State Hospital was a place of not only illness, but suffering, misunderstanding. This was much more a warehouse for the unwanted and outspoken than it ever was a place of healing. The history is, to put it as mildly and delicately as possible, fucked up beyond belief. It is genuinely shocking what conditions people will allow others to live in with just a dash of dehumanization. Today, the Trans-Allegheny Asylum is run equally as an educational museum and a for-profit tourist attraction, offering both historical tours and ghost tours whose stories often overlap but end on different themes. The history is depressing. The ghost stuff takes that history and fictionalizes it just enough to feel more comfortable to tourists than to flatly say, in this building, there was no escape from boredom and captivity, no chance for a better life or for meaningful personal change. The trajectory of an inmate's life flattens to nothing until it reaches the crematorium in the hospital's outbuilding. That's not fun spooky, that's not exciting terrifying, it's genuinely horrifying on a real human level, no ghosts required. The hospital's current museum administrators are so for-profit that they attempted to squeeze Bethesda for millions of dollars in use fees to have it be in their video game. Bethesda responded by changing the orientation of the northeast and southwest wings in the Fallout 76 version. They protrude from the main building at an inverse hook to the way they actually are. So, no fees required, clearly not even the same building, right? Inspired by. Heavily inspired. One might even say it's uncanny. The tour is a little restrictive, too. Photography is allowed, but video is discouraged, so what I've done here is taken hundreds, if not thousands of photos and arranged them in a linear order which may or may not simulate the sensation of movement, so long as it's clear that I'm in compliance. The tour guide I had was excellent, though. I was the only person to sign up for the tour, so another guide who mostly does the paranormal tours came along to pick up on some of how the history folks do it. So I feel like I got an extra dense version of the tour, less for me, more for the guide's colleague. It kept going until after sunset, the hallways growing dark and the shadows pooling deeply. The reason that they don't like video here is that they don't want the whole tour spoiled and replicated without selling tickets, so in honor of that, let me just say that going there in person and walking the floors is the way to do it and cannot be replicated with video. You don't feel how truly vast the proportions of the building are with video. You don't smell the mix of peeling paint and dry mold. You don't feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up as you walk through room after room of empty cells where in decades past, people with mental illness, people like me, were chained to walls out of fear, ignorance, and callous convenience. Out of sight, out of mind. The tour focuses a lot on the disparity between modern psychiatry and the punitive, sadistic models of the 19th century. They talk a lot about how disgustingly long it was before reform came to the system. Electroshock, for example, was super common up through the 1970s and is still used in some circumstances today. Lobotomies were once performed at this facility, sometimes many a day. The Weston State Hospital was never constructed to allow anyone to heal. It was constructed to keep people sealed away, within these walls, within the howling confines of their own minds. It even had a violent offenders wing that was constructed in the mid-century. It's this rather stark-looking edifice. The nurses and doctors occupied the central building. These floors have been refurbished and decorated with period-appropriate antiques to give the impression of what it might have been like to work there. What an odd contrast it makes. Like the massive division between rich and poor across the wider state of West Virginia, the division between those branded sick and those branded well is illuminated in tremendous contrast here at the Trans-Allegheny Asylum. For some, tea service, newspapers, radio. For others, chains, ice water, electricity. How sane can you be to participate in and perpetuate that kind of situation every single day? The place absolutely drips with old hatred and rancid despondency. That's what makes it feel haunted. The impression truly lingers, accentuated for me by the waning light and the minimal size of the tour group. We were very small against the vast emptiness of the place, the echoing halls and winding staircases. The guide even told me a really amazing story. In 1861, when the asylum was being constructed, Union sympathizers stole all of the money earmarked for the project by robbing the stagecoach caravan carrying it. That money led directly to the creation of West Virginia as a state, cleaving it from the Confederacy's grip on Virginia as a whole. The Union and the Confederacy fought over the asylum before it was even finished. It didn't see its first actual mental patients, or mental inmates in the case of 19th century's approach, until the end of the Civil War. The Trans-Allegheny is a crucial part of any West Virginia tour because without it, there would never have been a West Virginia. It's essential to the state's history. It's also illustrative of how American culture has, in some ways, become more compassionate as time has gone on, as we've left these kinds of medical prisons behind. More relevant to the project, it's just such a strange, decomposing castle of a building that it looks perfectly at home in Fallout 76's radioactive fiction. West Virginia is full of forgotten things, hidden in plain sight. The Allegheny Asylum is one of the most tarnished, radiant jewels of all the state's many ruins, a reminder of a past that it's often extremely tempting to try and forget. This kind of depressing history prevents the Trans-Allegheny from being my favorite ruin that I got to see in West Virginia. That prize goes instead to the Kmore Mining Complex, now protected from decay and development as part of the recently established New River Gorge National Park. Kmore was open from 1900 to 1962, spread out between two halves, Kmore Top and Kmore Bottom. Kmore Top is lost to time. Before this area could be preserved as a national park, residential homes took over this hilltop and built over much of what used to be the town after the mine closed. But there's nothing anyone could possibly do with the Kmore Bottom ruins. Between the two halves of Kmore is the Kmore Miners Trail, where every day around 300 workers made the trip either up or down the hill depending on their shift. In the space of 0.8 miles, the trail descends 900 feet down to the river below. There are a series of 821 steps to go down and then go back up. So don't you dare tell me I ain't never suffered from my channel because that shit had me sweating. And this was just everyday commute for the miners. The mining itself was the only thing they got paid for. This hike had to be performed gratis. Imagine doing 8 hours of dangerous, back-breaking labor and then doing this hike before you could even sleep. There were miners' quarters down in Caymore Bottom too, but Caymore Top was the primary residential half. There's a halfway point where the trail intersects with another winding trail along the side of the hill, elevated a long way from the riverbed. And then after that halfway point is the bulk of those 821 steps. Ore was transported along a small rail line in carts from the bottom to the top. You can still see that today. Sometimes miners would ride in the carts as well, but the plaques tell of one incident where the cable snapped and 2 men died. Thinking about that, the thing that makes me feel discomfort deep in my guts is the momentum. All that metal of the ore cart, gaining speed out of control downhill, you would instantly be going too fast to survive. All there would be to do would be to wait for impact. Awful way to go. And just one of hundreds of ways to die in the mining industry, many of which are even more desperate or sad or sudden. The ruins at Caymore Bottom, like the ruins of mining infrastructure out in the western deserts of Nevada and Utah, were more expensive to clean up than to leave behind. In 1960, a fire swept through the town and did pretty terminal damage. The mine stayed open somehow for an additional 2 years, which must have been an especially demoralizing period to work the mine. In 1978, Jimmy Carter signed into law protections for the New River Gorge as a national river, which gave the area some degree of preservation. In 2020, the National River designation was expanded and updated to become New River Gorge National Park, the 62nd in the national park system. Admission is currently free, but the park, as yet, is largely undeveloped. That might change as infrastructure increases. For now, the ruin at Caymore Bottom exists as it has since the Carter administration, waiting in a state of benign neglect, signs posted warning a person of the danger of going into the ruins, but no harried park ranger with a pistol on one hip and a citation notebook on the other to keep folks out. The Caymore Bottom ruins are so beautiful in how they've decayed, trees growing up where the roof collapsed years ago, weird gaps under the floor, old metal turned to the deep brown of wet rust instead of the brighter reddish desert rust. This massive collapsed steel structure was once the coal tipple. It's very obviously unstable and I didn't want to go near it, but it sure is gorgeous the way it's accordioning in on itself among the fallen leaves. There's even the remains of an elevated conveyor belt, a flap of rubber dangling off the old trestle. This is what makes it my favorite ruin in West Virginia. Nature has reclaimed everything but the toughest, most industrial bits. Kind of like the way Spruce Knob's rock was strong enough to resist erosion while all the uplift around it decayed into valleys and lowlands. Just within a more understandable human time frame here with the Caymore complex. Fallout 76 has my favorite game map of the 3 Bethesda Fallouts because it focuses in so much on this exact aesthetic of decay, the half-and-half mix of natural splendor and industrial decay. While not the whole purpose of the New River Gorge National Park, preserving this kind of historic decay is a major part of their preservational mission. This is an East Coast example of the kind of historic preservation being done on the West Coast, in places like Berlin, Nevada. The ruins hit a little different without the desert, though. Among the forests and in the mountains like this, the ruins feel secretive, more broken, more actively consumed by the flora around it. The New River Gorge hides at least 3 more ghost towns: Thurmond, Prince, and Quinnamont. Before the park was actively preserved, they were preserved by how truly hard they are to get to down tiny roads that wind tight to the walls of the hills and canyons on the way down to the surface of the New River. Thurmond I couldn't get to because the Park Service was repaving the entire road, step 1 in its revitalization process, eliminating some of the suspension-destroying potholes that the old roads have acquired over the years. We were turned away, which is frustrating because behind Caymore, Thurmond is known to have the best ruins. Third best, I guess, is Prince. Prince is, despite all odds, still an active Amtrak stop. You can take a passenger train here, so long as you figure out a plan of what happens then. Coal trains still run along its tracks. We even saw one. West Virginia coal out here is both past and present, the new trains running on the old tracks, thundering past the foundations of discarded infrastructure. Prince is a very cool stop for a Fallout 76 tour because of the Art Deco flourishes on the Prince station. Once, this was an optimistic gesture towards a bright future that coal would bring. The trains don't stop here anymore, though. The coal comes out of the West Virginia hills and trundles right through it, across the borders, leaving only black dust and soot to tarnish and darken the once bright paint of the Prince Rail Station. Quinnamont is right down the road from Prince. Its 2 main points of historic interest are 2 churches right next to each other down a winding dirt road. This is the Quinnamont Missionary Baptist Church. Because early 20th century mining was heavily segregated, this church was exclusively for black worshippers. The twist here is that this segregation wasn't an expression of any genuine sentiment on the matter, it was dictated as a way of life by the mining companies themselves. The National Park Service website phrases it like this, quote, The mining towns of New River Gorge were initially developed in very remote areas, requiring the miners to live in company-constructed houses. The houses were strategically segregated along racial and ethnic groups, black from white, Welsh and English from Irish, Italians from Polish, in order to help prevent unionization efforts among the miners. In spite of these attempts at segregation and polarization, each miner, no matter what the color of their skin or background, was there to make a living and depended on each other for safety in such a dangerous underground environment. As one miner said, "We're all black at the end of the day when we come out of that hellhole." End quote. To the mining companies, unionization was so threatening that they would rather disrupt the fabric of the communities of their workers and use racism as a wedge between them than simply accept that hard work breeds camaraderie, no matter what you tell people to do. Quinemont doesn't have industrial ruins. Instead, it has the ruins of what industrialists were willing to do in defense of their profit margins. There's plenty of assholes in America who are genuinely racist, but anytime there seems like an unusually large amount of them making American life miserable, it's never a bad idea to try to follow the money. Racism was once part of an explicit business model here in the town of Quinemont. Like so many other 19th century industries of the New River Gorge, we find these things not so much disappeared as transformed into more corporate and fluid forms in the modern era, less obvious, equally insidious. Were it not for the national park, New River Gorge would be largely obscure today. All these ruins, and all they have to teach, lie hidden in the shadows on the river valley floor underneath the freeway. When travelers pass through, they pass by hundreds of feet above, on a soaring bridge that carries people from one mountain to another, without ever touching the forgotten world below. From the roadway, the New River Gorge Bridge doesn't seem like the engineering marvel that it absolutely is. It's just a big flat line from one road to another. A driver is aware that there's a gulf of air underneath, but not at all how much. As a driver, I found the Penobscot Narrows Bridge to be much more harrowing. I haven't come to the bridge as a driver, though. I've come to it for how it is in Fallout 76, a thin catwalk suspended above an instantly fatal drop, which is possible, truly, actually, actionably possible to do. A tour company called The Bridge Walk, for the steep price of $92 a head, will take you along the maintenance catwalk that spans 3,000 feet above the New River. That's 1,000 yards, 10 football fields. It's a big fucking bridge is what I'm trying to say. I mentioned before that I'm afraid of heights. I figured, though, that it's for the video, and besides, if I did it in a video game, I can surely do it on a guided tour. In Fallout 76, the catwalk is broken, but pretty wide. I figured the game was exaggerating in how bare and unprotected the actual catwalk is. The first hint of how colossally wrong I was about that came when signing in. There's a release form for danger of death and a next of kin emergency contact in case the worst happens. I want to be clear that they have never lost a tourist, not once. But this is not Disneyland. This is a thin piece of steel from 1977, stretching over 3,000 feet across a river that is, itself, 876 feet below. The peak of the Washington Monument was only 555 feet. As far as famous tall structures go, the bridge is closest to the Eiffel Tower's 1,063 feet of height, except in that case, you've got the tower underneath you. Here you've got nothing but void. Void and snow and blowing wind. There are hatches in the catwalk where you have to either look down through the gap into the nothing below or else step blindly onto the seams. I have never paid so much to feel such mortal animal terror. The only thing that kept me from a full-blown panic attack was the knowledge that having a panic attack would be even more dangerous. The catwalk curves as the arch of the bridge does, meaning you can't see the other end until you reach the exact midpoint. You just have to trust the process of putting one foot in front of the other. The steelwork creates a crazy optical illusion that Fallout 76 doesn't even replicate at all. By the time a person reaches the midpoint, it truly doesn't matter if they want to turn back. It's the same either way. Our guide couldn't be more comfortable. She stood with two legs planted on opposite bars of the guardrail, leaning out over the side a little to take pictures with people's cell phones. She wasn't even wearing her safety harness at the time. She'd done this so much. Here, you can plainly see that Nate is having a wonderful time, and I, on the other hand, look as if I have a centipede crawling into my ass, but I'm too scared to tell anybody. Which was about right. Everyone else paid $92 to be there. I didn't want to disrupt their experience with my incandescent anxiety. So, folks, there you go. When it comes down to the wire, my urge to be polite is ever so slightly stronger than my will to live. It was, and will, I hope, remain the most gut-churningly frightening thing that I've ever done, and one of the most unique, and one of the most absurd. Bridgewalk's slogan, painted onto the side of their shuttle bus, is "The Walk of a Lifetime." I snarked about that a little at first, before I knew anything about anything. On the way back, I just flatly agreed with the statement. That was something that not only had I only ever done in a fictional context, is something I thought that I only ever could do in a fictional context. Out here on the byways of West Virginia, on the Freedom Trail of Boston, at the peak of the Washington Monument, and in the armpit of Baltimore's public park system, I have experienced the entire range of human emotion. To me, this is what separates a vacation from an adventure. A vacation is joyful, positive, always, at least if it goes like you plan it does. An adventure requires both risk and friction. It requires being open to negative experiences and emotions as well as positive ones, riding out the valleys of the journey in pursuit of greater peaks. To get through my walk of a lifetime, I had to swallow an actual fear of death, even though rationally the safety system would catch me in the event of a fall. Rationality has nothing to do with it. The entire journey is about, instead, sensation. To be alive and present and truly inhabiting the body you've got, pitching it into the world ahead, seeking comfort and excitement in the unknown. This is the experience that Fallout games simulate so well, that friction of combining reward with risk, satisfaction with danger. That's what makes the adventure intriguing. We are, as modern humans, pretty civilized creatures, and civilization is good. The more people are exposed to other people's thoughts and ways of life, the broader a person's perspective becomes. That's not all we are, though. There is an animal self that thrives in adversity, that craves not just intellectual freedom or emotional freedom, but physical freedom, navigational freedom, the freedom to roam over every hilltop and climb every mountain, the freedom of the animal world that we are no longer fully a part of. Video games are such a vital outlet for these impulses. They're an immersive and exciting way to experience those emotions and inhabit that animal self. I've always loved Fallout particularly because of how it takes that basic impulse towards the freedom of an open world and then enhances it with historical reference, cultural reference, dark ironies and black humor, layers of symbolism, and layers of rust. On the West Coast, once I began tracing out the paths that I had traveled in the game worlds, the parallels came easy and constantly. On the East Coast, I had to work for it. And in working for it harder, I think I may have had a deeper experience. I found myself, over the course of this project, frequently startled and surprised by the situations and moods that I would encounter. I never knew what to expect. Anything was on the table. I could have just as easily broken down on the side of the road and given up as completed the project. I treated my experience as an adventure, so an adventure is exactly what I found. There's so much you can plan for with a trip like this, so much you can pack, but there's really only one thing you truly, essentially need. It's that curiosity about what the unfilled marker on the map compass might mean. Curiosity about what you might find there, and curiosity about who you might become when the journey reaches its end. Fallout taught me that. Thanks for watching.